is
I'm just going to drop my.
8.
Okay, yeah, I'll clip that in.
We'll begin. Well, welcome to Imperial College, those from outside the college. My name is Martin Seagate. I'm one of the co-directors of the Grantham Institute. I'm going to say very little other than to welcome you here and to introduce to you James Sterling, the Provost of Imperial College. James.
Thanks very much, Martin. So I'd just like to repeat a very warm welcome to you all on behalf of Imperial College to this Grantham Institute event, Global Solutions for Global Challenges, the aim of which is to highlight the impacts of climate and environmental change on natural resources, energy systems and health, and to showcase the technologies and the solutions available to mitigate these impacts. The Grantham Institute is one of the college's 5 Global Challenge Institutes addressing challenges in health, energy, data, security, and the environment. They are very much the jewels in our crown, exemplifying the college's strategy of building world-leading multidisciplinary research and education on top of outstanding strength in core disciplines right across the STEM-B landscape: science, engineering, medicine, and business, always with a clear focus on societal impact and societal benefit. The Grantham was founded in 2007 with a donation to Imperial from Jeremy and Hannelore Grantham through their Foundation for the Protection of the Environment. Building on the strong foundation laid by its first director, Professor Sir Brian Hoskins, the Institute has recently expanded its remit from a sole focus on climate change research to encompassing environmental science and engineering. And it's now under the excellent co-leadership of Professor Joe Haig and Professor Martin Seagate. They have been very busy. Actually, that's an understatement. They've been extraordinarily busy since they took up office last year. And you can read more details about what the Institute has been doing, what it's achieved in the last year through the annual report, which is being launched today and which you should find a copy of on your seat. But importantly, the Grantham Institute retains core strength in climate research and education, integrating colleagues and capabilities from all areas across the college and working closely with external partners and stakeholders from other academic institutions and from public and private sector organisations. And through events like this one today, it is playing an influential and very visible role in the run-up to COP21 in Paris, offering practical, scientific and technical knowledge of the very highest quality and using this to help influence opinion and shape decision-making. So, in closing, I'm absolutely delighted that the college is hosting this event today. It's great to see you all here, and a particularly warm welcome to those of you visiting Imperial for the first time. I hope you have a very informative and enjoyable evening. Thank you. And I'd now like to hand over to Professor Joe Haig.
Thanks, James. And can I add my words of welcome to you all for coming to this event? You all realise that it's a great time, a very important time for issues to do with climate change and the environment. The impact of these are on the natural resources, on energy systems and on health are just a few of the problems that are going to face us in the future and are going to become more crucial to solve for living for people across the world. This has been acknowledged by a series of meetings run by the United Nations. At the end of September, we're going to have a meeting on sustainability goals, in which the United Nations will try and agree 17 goals associated with poverty, food, equality, quality of life, and to take these forward into the next half of the century. How to finance them, of course, will be a big issue, and that hasn't been satisfactorily addressed. The meeting at Addis Ababa on financing for development in July was friendly discussions, but no particular agreements on tax methods or any other methods. So that's something that still needs to be addressed. But then, as James has already said, at the end of November and December, there's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, 21st Conference of Parties in Paris, which is going to meet for different countries to try and agree on committing to reducing carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, which are causing the global warming that we've seen over the last at least century and a half. So global politics is actually at a pivotal point at the moment. There's many interesting things going on in the world. There's some leadership now coming from the United States in this area. China is showing an interest in energy governments. Outside of government activities, there are many businesses that are now really realising the point that they need to take action to address this issue in the future and acting on it. In the UK, there's a number of good initiatives going on. We're at a bit of an uncertainty of what's happening with the current government, what their decisions will be in terms of climate change and environmental issues, with changes at DEC. And we understand that there's going to be announcements after the spending review that will make these things more clear. So at the Grantham Institute, as James has indicated, we are set up to support and initiate research on anything to do with environment and climate, but particularly focusing on those multidisciplinary areas which perhaps fall between the cracks of conventional disciplines. We want to support these areas of research and also make sure that the results of the research are made available to the community more widely so that they can act on them and make them really useful. We want to help to advise the community and help them form opinions in any way that we can. As part of our activities, we run various educational programs. We have a strong cohort of PhD students, supplemented now by, we are coordinating the Imperial College doctoral training partnership funded by NERC in Science and Solutions for a Changing Planet. And then we're quite excited by the prospect, starting with students entering in October 2016, of a new master's course on climate change management and finance that we think is actually leading the world in a new area and way of looking at things. We run a number of events. You're at one today, but we have many going on for different communities and interests, and of course we try to improve our outreach to the public and to schools and educational outlets. So thank you very much for coming. Please join our mailing list if you're not on it already. Read our Outlook and use the Twitter, which is up here at global_solutions. And I hope we will have an interesting, and I'm sure we will have a very interesting and profitable discussion. So I'm very grateful to the speakers for agreeing to come today, and also to Richard Black, who's agreed to chair the meeting. So Richard is standing up, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about him first. he's the sort of neutral person here to chair the discussion. So Richard studied natural sciences at Cambridge before joining the BBC in 1985, working in current affairs, science, health and sport, and as science correspondent. Next, as BBC Environment Correspondent, he was representing the BBC at many UN summits, including 5 UNFCCC meetings and Rio. He's reported on fields of many issues such as carbon capture and storage, nuclear power, amphibian conservation, whaling, forestry, aquaculture, and earthquake prediction. And I know not on here is atmospheric physics, because he's consulted me on a number of occasions, and he's a marvellous journalist in actually extracting out of the scientists what it is that they're trying to say onto the paper. So from 2012, Richard was Director of Communications for the Global Ocean Commission before setting up the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit just over a year ago. So we're very pleased to have him here. Thanks, Richard, for doing the chairing.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. It's a pleasure and an honour to be invited here this afternoon to chair this meeting, which is very, 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 very timely, I think, and the way it's been put together I found particularly interesting because, if you like, the three fields that we're covering are the natural world, the technological world, and the human world. And when you think about what a response to climate change, or indeed other environmental issues, concerns, it has to concern those three dimensions. So for this afternoon, the format is going to be, we're going to have three talks initially from speakers and experts outside the Grantham Imperial family, and each of those will be followed by a response from someone inside the Grantham and Imperial family. And during the majority of this, we'll take questions for clarification only if there's time. We do have an hour set aside at the end for a much longer question and answer session, which I hope will be fascinating. I should welcome not only those of you in the room, but those of you who are maybe joining on the webcast as well, because this is being webcast, and we will also be hoping to take some questions and comments in from that route, as well as from you here in the room. The hashtag, as Joe said, is hashtag global_solutions. So time, I think, is going to be something of our enemy this afternoon, so I'm not going to say any more at this stage, but I will introduce our first speaker, who's Andrew Norton, who earlier this year took over as director of the International Institute for Environment and Development, which is not only one of the leading UK think tanks, but one of the leading global think tanks. It's not an institution that shouts its name into the public domain, but behind the scenes it's hugely influential and hugely respected. So Andrew has worked in Africa, he's worked in the Caribbean, he's worked in South Asia, and he joins us now to talk about managing natural resources for human resilience in a changing world.
Thank you very much, Richard, and also many thanks to Grantham and to Imperial for the opportunity to speak here. Delighted to be here. It's kind of a big topic to cover in 15 minutes. Global solutions, global challenges, natural resources on a global scale. I thought I would start with a personal note. I'm an anthropologist by training, and I did my doctoral research in a farming community in Mali in the 1980s. It was the first of 3 years of drought in the 1980s. And it came to a community that had seen in the previous decade, in the 1970s, the first really severe drought in living memory. Farmers there had already acquired an understanding of the way the climate had changed. And they talked very much in those terms, comparing it, if you like, to the glory days of the 50s and 60s in the West African Sahel with reliable and abundant rainfall. They would describe a reality where rainfall had become unreliable, where it fell in big clumps with long gaps in between, often at key parts of the farming season, and changed dramatically between years. This picture is consistent with what we now understand to be the impact of anthropogenic warming on the West African Sahel. I didn't know that at the time, and maybe that was before we truly understood the links. So the challenge itself is not new, but our understanding now of the frightening scale of the challenge is, of course, new. Between 1980 and 2012, it's estimated that the annual damage from extreme weather-related events rose globally from $20 billion per year to $150 billion per year. That totals over that period close to $2 trillion. Examples include floods in Bangladesh and Thailand, typhoons in the Caribbean, and droughts both in the West African Sahel and, of course, the Horn of Africa. Poor people and poor nations, of course, are particularly vulnerable to these impacts. Even if we succeed in dramatically limiting greenhouse gas emissions, beyond really our wildest dreams, we must anticipate that there will be growing impacts over the coming decades in those societies. And we can add to that a range of other pressures on natural resources and the human societies that they underpin, from soil degradation, deforestation, depletion of water resources. And if you add all that together, it becomes very clear that natural resources and the human societies on which they depend are under great stress and going to be under increasing stress. A few words about the title of the event, Global Solutions to Global Challenges, and to challenge that a little, I think, from the perspective of the realities of the Global South. Climate change is certainly a global challenge. A few of the solutions will indeed be global. But when it comes to building the resilience of poor people in poor countries, most of the solutions will be local. They will come from the aggregation of many local innovations tailored to local settings. But you need a range of political economy and technical conditions to enable those solutions to emerge. These range from the ways in which public money is distributed and managed, to local access to helpful technologies, and critically to the conditions under which local communities hold rights in natural resources. The same goes for challenges of resource degradation and the associated challenge of managing competition for control and access. So my alternative strapline for today is local to global solutions for global challenges. And I will now move on to illustrate that, basically with 3 examples. My first example of the multi-level nature of the search for solutions concerns commercial land acquisition. This, obviously, we've seen an intense debate about this since 2008, under often the title of land grabbing. In those years, 2008 to 2011 particularly, there was a sharp acceleration in land acquisitions driven by a range of factors, including biofuel mandates in developed countries, the rising price of food, and increasingly also a recognition of the potential long-term strategic value of land in the context of urban growth and middle-class growth, particularly in Asia. Why the term land grabbing? Well, because the nature of these large-scale transactions has tended to involve the sale through long-term leases by a higher-level authority, usually the state, of rights in natural resources effectively out from under the feet of local land users to a commercial buyer. Problems arise in essence because the complex fabric of local customary rights are often not coded firmly enough in national law. The premier global source for data, the Land Matrix, now estimates the volume of global acquisitions by the definitions they use since 2000 at 35 million hectares. You have to have a bit of caution about the global numbers. This is a picture, a representation of reality, but the truth is we don't know about much of this. We do think that the pace of acquisitions has slowed in the last couple of years, probably because of the declining, or if you like, a little bit of the bottom falling out of the biofuels boom. But it's still a massive reality for poor people in poor countries. And the urgent priority is to ensure that the rights of people who depend on natural resource access for their livelihoods are more clearly recognised by a range of stakeholders. Technical solutions can play a role in this. Harnessing new technologies to deliver low-cost accessible systems for documenting land rights, using GPS and barefoot land surveying approaches to engage local actors. All of this is very promising. But land, in the end, is inherently political and emotive. Technology can help, but it cannot solve the governance challenges, which are key. The global focus in this area, in these years, created political momentum, which led to something which is, I think, a reasonable, way forward. The voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure covering a range of natural resources. The legitimacy of these was built through over a year of intergovernmental negotiations with a lot of involvement from researchers, civil society organisations, multilateral institutions, of course, and the private sector. Making them work in practice is also likely to require joined-up efforts at multiple levels. If you look at the actors, governments bear responsibility for land governance. Civil society organisations and researchers can play a role in terms of documenting what's actually happening and whether the thing is working, as well as maybe also, to a certain degree, in facilitating mobilisation of people at the local level. The private sector can show leadership also by operationalising the guidelines in their corporate practice. And there are a couple of well-known examples, sort of global beverage brands, very familiar. It may be perhaps responding to a degree to good campaigns work from Oxfam and others. And then aid donors as well can play a role in terms of providing financial resources and technical expertise. So that's an example of a multi-level local to global arena for looking for solutions to an issue of natural resources under stress affecting local livelihoods. My second example concerns coastal and marine ecosystems. These provide enormous benefits, and we are really very little aware of the degree to which and the scale of livelihoods in developing countries that depend on these. Over 43 million people, mostly in the global south, are directly employed in the fisheries. The majority are artisanal fishers dependent on coastal waters, and the total figure for the people who depend on fisheries for their livelihoods, once you take into account marketing, processing, etc., almost certainly amounts to more than 200 million. Coastal and marine ecosystems also provide a range of local and global public goods. At the local scale, they recycle nutrients, regulate natural hazards, and protect against floods. They also underpin spiritual and cultural values in these societies and can be significant assets for recreation and tourism. At the global scale, of course, they store carbon and are a significant factor in helping to regulate the climate. Global fish stocks, of course, are under threat from overfishing, pollution, habitat destruction, and climate change. Not all of these issues can be dealt with at the local level, but there are substantial benefits that can be gained by giving local communities incentives to proactively manage fish stocks and broader coastal ecosystems. Payment for ecosystem services schemes can compensate fishers for lost revenues, and we have some good examples of this from Bangladesh in particular. Beyond compensating for lost earnings, ecosystem services payment schemes can also be used to spur coastal communities to restore and conserve local habitats, including mangrove trees. Clarifying property rights is a particular challenge in relation to aquatic environments, but it's an important factor to make schemes effective, and there are some interesting examples. For example, in Eritrea, in the southern Red Sea coast, the government has restored some customary systems of rights and tenure, which go way back. So there are things you can build on as well. Engaging with communities and rigorous research into the context are also prerequisites for making progress. Sustainable financing is also a big part of the picture, and this means mapping the sellers and the buyers in a chain. Buyers of coastal ecosystem services can include coastal municipalities, the tourism sector, and international carbon markets as well. So let me return for my third example, the final one, to the question of climate change impacts in the African drylands. Work by IIED colleagues, including my predecessor as director, Camilla Toulmin, well known to Grantham, in Isiolo County in Kenya, illustrates how investing in the software of local level institutions to build resilience can work. Over the last 15 to 20 years, this drought-prone region has suffered more intense and frequent drought events, and the climate predictions basically tell us that this will continue and get worse. The extended drought of 2008 to 11 caused livestock losses estimated at around 40 to 60% in many parts of Isiolo County. As we expect these events to occur at less than 5-year intervals going forward, the recovery time for animal stocks is going to be insufficient unless practices change. 80% of the population are dependent on livestock, so this is a critical issue in that region. Amongst the Boran people of northern Kenya, the Data is a customary neighbourhood institution which engages in the management of natural resources. IIED, with funding from DFID, has been working with the government of Kenya to build resilience to drought. This has involved strengthening the Data to conserve high-value grazing and water resources for use over the dry season. Local data councils identify the grazing areas that need to be set aside as drought reserves, and they take that forward training young people also to patrol these areas and conserve both the grazing resources and the water sources. although there are short-term costs in terms of losing immediate access in non-drought periods, the benefits of improved conservation massively outweigh these. Assessments from a partial drought in 2014 demonstrate that animal mortality was considerably lower in Isiolo. And indeed, this didn't just benefit the people of Isiolo County, but also people from neighbouring districts who migrated into Isiolo with their livestock. Data members secured a remarkable return on their investment of at least 24 to 1, we estimate. Had the rains not arrived when they did, and had this partial drought turned into a serious drought event, the value of the avoided mortalities in animals would have yielded returns we estimate as high as 90 to 1. This example shows that local institutions working to produce remarkably improved resilience in the way natural resources are managed in the face of climate threats can be a significant part of the solution. But their ability to do this was enabled powerfully by a national framework that decentralised significant decision-making to the county level, as well as international inputs of funds analysis and facilitation. So I've given 3 examples of how local institutions, enabled by supportive frameworks at the national and global level, can be the bedrock of at least some of the solutions that we need to global challenges in terms of natural resource stress and scarcity. In coming years, societies around the globe will need to find ways to build greater resilience to extreme climate events in this warming world. Investment in physical infrastructure, the hardware of disaster resilience, needs to be matched by strengthening of intangible but powerful institutions that help people to manage risks and achieve collective agreement on how resources can best be used. To conclude, building resilience is an intensely local process. But changes necessary at the local level can benefit from the enabling conditions, particularly in terms of political change and technological solutions at higher levels. This in itself is a huge challenge. Very little climate or development finance presently is delivered functionally and effectively to the local level to support local institutions, whether we're talking about local governments or whether we're talking about the social organisation of people trying to build their own resilience. And much more than finance is needed. Changes in incentives in regulatory frameworks that determine, in particular, rules of tenure are particularly important. Also, that determine the way markets work. These need to work in a resilience-friendly way as well. I don't want to play down the scale of the challenge. If one steps back for a moment from the hyper-optimistic narrative of the Sustainable Development Goals, which will be launched in New York in a couple of weeks, it is blindingly obvious that much of the world is not in shape to even start to move forward in the way that I have described. We need to understand much better how these solutions can work in the toughest environments affected by conflict and fragility. Whatever the scale of the challenge, we do need to find processes to confront the global challenges of natural resource management that are multi-level, politically and technologically smart, and that enable local actors to find their own solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew. This is one of the reasons why I always enjoyed speaking to people from IIED. You'd learn something about, the way land rights are organised in Kenya one week, and then next week you'd find something from Bangladesh, and the next week something from Latin America, and you'd end up a much more wise and rounded person as a result. So thank you very much. To respond to that, we have next Wouter Beitardt. Wouter's a senior lecturer in water resources and environmental change at Imperial College London. He works for DFID and UNESCO and just about everyone in the whole field, as far as I can make out from his biography. An expert on water. Wouter, your 10 minutes.
Very much. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and in general for the opportunity of replying to what I thought was a very interesting and insightful talk with plenty of topics to pick up on, but I'm keen to start with one of the very last things that Andrew said about how to create resilience in an environment that is politically and technologically smart. And indeed, I'm keen to further reflect a bit upon that combination of how to create resilience, how to generate new knowledge in such systems which are characterized by high diversity, decentralized, localized solutions, and the need to really try and identify locally tailored solutions to the very many threats that natural resources management faces, whether it's about fish stocks in estuaries or land use management in Kenya or in the Andes, a region that personally I'm more familiar with. So localized solutions, I've given there a couple of characteristics which aren't exactly the same but very compatible with many of the terms that Andrew has already mentioned. The need to incorporate or to include from the very start the many different actors and the various levels of decision making and governance that those systems characterize. A picture there at the bottom of a valley in the Andes of Peru, where indeed very many different types of pressures on the local ecosystem exist, from globalized climate change to localized land degradation, mining companies that come in that potentially generate conflicts with local farmers, etc. So a very diverse system with a very strong data scarcity and a lot of knowledge gaps in order to that need to be addressed in order to make sustained and sustainable answers and decisions about how to optimally manage such a system. It's very hard to capture those very many characteristics of a socio-ecological system into one graph, but here I've tried to bring it together and emphasize especially this relation between knowledge and data, technologies. Imperial College is a university very strongly focused on technology, so I'll try and bring that into the picture, and particularly try and reflect a bit on how we can use technology to make that link to strengthen the knowledge about the socio-ecological system and how we can better understand it and make better decisions on how to manage that. And essentially, I've tried here to combine, on the one hand, the physical or the physical science based very strongly on data, on processing, on quantitative knowledge, the typical scientific approach, with and try to combine that with the local actors that base their decisions on often very different types of knowledge, the localized knowledge that Andrew already mentioned, and whether we can find a way of strengthen that interaction between both, coming to more adaptive, locally tailored, flexible solutions that are able to deal with even very, very complex and very uncertain processes like climate change. So I mentioned the role of technology, which, as an engineer myself, perhaps a bit the other side of the spectrum of anthropology, but the entry point that I'm very keen on taking and try to reflect, well, how can we leverage new technologies in order to generate actionable knowledge, locally relevant knowledge that can be used to inform decision making and creating resilience of the socio-ecological system at very local scale. Obviously, technology provides a lot of opportunity, especially these days. There is very fast technological development in areas as diverse as sensor development, wireless sensors, more cost-effective, more robust, more easily usable sensors, but also in terms of the way that data is being converted into knowledge, advanced processing, computing technologies, as well as the way that is communicated to end users. Mobile phones are a very, very good example. The internet in general has changed dramatically the way that and the velocity with which information is shared and flows between different actors. I gave there on the right-hand side the cover of a recent report commissioned by the UN about the data revolution and how that might be leveraged to support resilience, poverty alleviation, adaptation towards climate change and other pressures. But especially within the poverty alleviation and the sustainable development communities, you often come across also people that are much more cautious about how to use technology and try and like to emphasize that technology at the same time might have a risk. Technology associated with powerful multinationals, associated with very expensive tools and gadgets that only the rich can afford. I heard earlier on that apparently there's an Apple event in San Francisco later today. So at the same time, technology has the risk that it reinforces inequality, that it's been hijacked by those that have access, indeed, in the rich world and even in the poor world. The richer elites might have more access to mobile phones. So we have to be very careful that we don't apply technology in a way that bypasses the poor, or that reinforces the inequalities and the current gradients of power and knowledge. So let me give a couple of examples that we're working with and that very much resonated what Andrew said earlier on. Citizen science, one of those recent upcoming concepts. One can argue, well, citizen science is a fundamental part of scientific practice, but these days, with the availability of technology, there's often, and especially in water resources and in natural resources management in general, as the possibility of breaking open those formal centralized structures of data collection. Here in the UK, for instance, the Environment Agency, or in many other countries, meteorological officers, etc., but allow many more actors, also non-specialists or people with a less scientific background, to come in and to directly generate evidence that might support an agenda, an interest, a theme that they would like to pursue. And there at the bottom, some examples of participatory monitoring we're doing in the Andes to support or to generate information about the impact of grazing on ecosystem services, water availability, and how to make local practices more resilient to things like droughts and climate change, not too dissimilar to the example in Kenya that Andrew gave earlier on. So an example of how technology really can support and a multi-level and polycentric approach to resilience creation in a socio-ecological system. That is about data generation being the basis for knowledge creation, but raw data somehow need to be converted into useful knowledge, ideally actionable knowledge that allows decision makers to inform their decisions. And so also in terms of, and I'll skip over this one, in terms of data processing and communication, the mobile phones, the internet, and the other technologies already mentioned have a tremendous opportunity to bring new actors more closely, more directly into the generation of knowledge. And I think particularly one of the great opportunities here is that it might turn the typical or the classic one-way communication from the scientist in their ivory tower being the guardian of knowledge, passing on that knowledge to those that make decisions, to a much more dynamic, two-way, multi-way, interactive communication and conversation between different actors, which not only makes the entire system more richer and more resilient, but also allows to combine different types of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, expert knowledge, which scientists sometimes might be a bit quick to disregard or ignore, or simply have difficulties in integrating what is often much more qualitative knowledge into their typical quantitative workflow that is more characteristic for scientists. A concept that in social science is often referred to as knowledge co-creation, really leveling the playing field to what used to be a much more hierarchical approach to generating knowledge. Of course, there are many challenges, many of which that Andrew has already mentioned as well. And I mentioned earlier on the risk of hijacking and elitism, polycentric governance, which is upcoming, especially with the publications and the legacy of Elinor Ostrom, which here I put isn't equal to chaos, but might, in certain conditions, descend into too much decentralization and a lack of structuring, which might lead to unnecessary duplication, waste of resources. So especially in a polycentric, multi-level socio-ecological system, it's important to still try and regulate it sufficiently to avoid that the resources in time and as well as monetary resources are optimally allocated. And I think a common goal, I'm sure Andrew would agree with, is that we need to try, especially as scientists, try and find ways to create new knowledge that supports those localized solutions, that is tailored to the local environment and the local context, but at the same time is actionable, has a can be used directly into making decisions at the local level. And especially these days with technologies such as the internet, I think the wording that Andrew used, localized solutions embedded in a global framework, is essentially what these kind of technologies allow, and what as scientists we should aim for in order to make local situations more resilient and more sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Walter. Well, for everything that can happen with land rights and technology and so on in far-flung parts of the world, there is still the challenge, the ultimate challenge of reducing emissions. And in this country, of course, things are going really well at the moment. The government's absolutely on side. Low carbon technology is being rolled out all over the place. That was my fantasy world. Lots of stuff actually is happening behind the headlines, and one of the reasons it's happening is because of an organisation that some of you may have come across called the Carbon Trust, which was set up a number of years ago really to work very closely with and kind of for government, but now is free and works independently, advising companies and other institutions, including advising governments, not only Britain but across the world, of what they can do. So the Carbon Trust probably has as good a view as anyone of what's actually happening across Britain in companies, in universities, and so on and so forth to cut carbon. So let me introduce our next speaker, who's from the Carbon Trust, Director of Policy and Markets, Tom Jennings. Tom.
Great, thank you, Richard, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to talk today. Yes, I'm going to talk about the importance of innovation and collaboration in transforming the energy system and the energy systems globally. Very quick introduction on what the Carbon Trust does. There are three things we do. We provide advice, as Richard said, to governments and business. We provide certification and footprinting services to measure how much carbon, which is obviously quite a critical thing if you want to then reduce it. And then we also deliver large technology programs, traditionally one of the main R&D delivery bodies here in the UK. But over the last 3 or 4 years now, we've been working internationally, a lot of work in Latin America, particularly in Mexico and Brazil, as well as in China and South Africa, and continue to work with more and more international governments. All the profits that we make in profit-making areas of the Carbon Trust will get reinvested back into the central pot and back into our mission, which is to accelerate the move to a sustainable low-carbon economy. But yeah, back to the low-carbon energy system, and a very complicated slide here, which is kind of on purpose, which is that the energy system has lots of different components to it. And quite often people immediately switch to thinking about electricity, which is obviously only one of those components. You can see electricity generation down there in the bottom. But obviously of equal or greater importance are other areas of the energy system, the demand side on energy efficiency, heat generation technologies, you see there at the top, storage, media, both heat and electricity, as well as transport down there on the bottom left. And to give a kind of flavour of some of the innovations required across all these different areas, again, a lot of the conversation gets focused on wind and solar PV, but there's innovation required across all those different technologies down there on the bottom. Wind, solar, nuclear and CCS, all of those technologies have next generation technologies that I know Imperial and other institutions as well as clean tech companies are working on. Those next generation solutions needing to compete with the very rapidly declining costs of the current generation solutions aided by mass manufacturer, PV, current gen PV being a key example. Then there's other technologies, not so much in the UK, but globally, like geothermal. There's next generation geothermal as well. Plus marine, where Scotland and the UK does take a lead. In transport, obviously great leaps at the moment in EVs and hybrid vehicles. Hydrogen vehicles, there was lots of interest and people kind of cooled back off it. But looking at the whole energy system, if we have lots of CCS, that might produce lots of cheap hydrogen. Hydrogen vehicles come back in the running. Hydrogen also could be an interesting solution for heat at the top. So you really do need to think about this and as an energy system to work out which of these different components might take off. And what you'll notice, I don't have a slide on my prediction on which will dominate and what the balance will be across these different technologies. There are very different views on that answer. It's massively dependent on costs and what you believe are costs right now, how much those costs will reduce. But the important point is we are going to need pretty much all those technologies, or at the very minimum, the option for these technologies, which is where innovation comes in. And the important point is we need lots of innovation. To give you a bit of an example of the next point, which is that there's no one country that can do this by themselves. I mean, you saw a lot of different technologies there. And this is an example of the UK, because this is close to the work that we do. So we've been working together with the UK government and the other public sector bodies focused on low carbon innovation on things called TINAs, Technology Innovation Needs Assessments. So they're a set of analyses on all the different low carbon technologies. And we developed those on behalf of all the different government departments and institutions that you can see there down at the bottom. So we did one for 11 different technologies, but we then, over the last 4 or 5 years, but last year, brought it all together, working with the government on a strategy. And if you add it up, there's, in the end, 44 priority areas. Now, this is just a short list, so obviously there's a long list. But that short list, if you estimate the cost of supporting that, it's about 3 to 4 billion. That's in the UK alone. But the government over the last 5 years and historically has had a budget more of $1 billion. So there's a massive gap between the 4 to 5 billion, just the shortlist needs, and the traditional 1 to 1.5 billion the government's had. And as you know, the Treasury is not exactly awash with money. So obviously one solution would be to quadruple that budget. I wish DEC and BIS good luck. But the other ways of doing so is obviously working efficiently across government, encouraging greater private sector investment, but crucially, and what I'm going to talk today, greater international collaboration to share this burden and make the most of the different countries' skills and capabilities. So to that end, we're doing some work at the moment with the Foreign Office, firstly to understand which countries do lead in different technologies, and then secondly to work out how that collaboration could work and what kind of models. And we are literally, we've just started this, so this is all very nascent. And I'm really interested to the discussion actually at the end to get your own views. So this is just one example of an analysis we're doing. This is on one particular technology, so within electricity storage, looking at who are different country leaders. So what you can see there is the supply chain on the left, the raw inputs, the materials, the RD&D going on to manufacture, and then deployment and operations and maintenance over there on the right. And we might have some academics here who might be interested how we did this, which you can see along the bottom. So we created this index from a range of different measures depending on different stages of the value chain. It's reasonably crude, but it gives a kind of interesting picture. So what you can see there is that if you focus on innovation, which is that RD&D component, there are some countries there in this particular technology, Japan, the US, which dominate. So Japan's dominating all the way across, apart from deployment, but even there it's pretty strong. And the US, Korea, Germany are present all the way down that supply chain. But you have developing countries taking large roles later on in supply chain. So in manufacturing, you can see the likes of Malaysia and Mexico with very large roles to play. And there's obviously developing countries in the inputs phase as well. So interesting coming up to COP and the international discussions on climate change. This isn't just a story of the developed world bestowing things on the developing world. Already those supply chains are integrated. The other thing you can see is there's a large difference between the likes of the big leaders of Japan and like the US and someone like the UK, which has got this very focused leadership down there in RD&D, but less of a presence on manufacturing and deployment. So it would have a different type of role in this supply chain. So that's if we were to get the right people around the table, we hope that this will help to get the right people around the table, and also to help in terms of if we were for different groups of countries to be focusing on different types of technologies, what those focus groups would look like. The second point is then how should collaboration happen? There's lots of different models of collaboration, and this is the current thing we're looking at. Well, one of those models is the large international bodies that do this. So the key one is the IEA, and its emphasis is on roadmaps and enabling collaboration. On renewables, IRENA, again, roadmaps, providing advice. The EU is a particular example which provides roadmaps and then funds R&D across the EU. So I said roadmaps 3 times. You hear lots of things around roadmaps. And one of the questions we've got is, how do you go beyond roadmaps? So if you're in industry, do you study IEA's roadmaps? How do you take that roadmap and that report and turn that into a large-scale investment by industry? So that's one of the key things we're going to be looking at. And again, I'm very interested in your thoughts later on. So we haven't got the answer yet, and I don't think we will even by the end of the study. I think one principle which we believe is necessary for this is for collaboration to be focused. Well, one, to have industry at the centre of it, and 2, for it to be focused around points of self-interest. So I'm going to give an example that talks about that. It's a Karma Trust example. And which is our offshore wind accelerator. So this is a R&D program focused on offshore wind development. It brings together all the leading developers of the wind farms. So the critical thing here, the reason we got all these companies to work with each other, because quite often it's hard to get companies to work with each other, is that they're the users of the technology. So they don't care about the IP to that extent. What they want is ultimately to be able to buy cheap wind farms so they can then deploy them. So as users of technology, they're actually very open to collaborating. And that's been the thing that's allowed us to unlock this particular program. And I think that concept of mutual self-interest might be critical to getting industry to collaborate globally. In this particular example, we have got most of the market, so the 9 companies, it's 77% of the market, and the benefit for them is for every £12 there's £12 invested for every £1 invested by each one of the members. So they get massive leverage by working with each other. And given we're at Imperial, and we might have some engineers in the audience, I thought I'd end with some pictures of steel and concrete. So these are some examples of some demonstrations that we've been doing. So there was this is in foundations. So the bit where the turbine stops to the bottom of the sea. where we ran a competition which shortlisted a number of different technologies from a global range of different companies. We shortlisted some on the right. So the one on the top left there, Gifford BMT, I'm not going to pronounce the next one, the gravity-based foundation. So that technology, that whole thing, that big white and red thing, plus the foundation floats out and then sinks down to the bottom of the ocean. The universal foundation, the thing on the right, is a suction bucket foundation. It works a bit like one of the plungers you use in the toilet. So that the plunger goes to the sea bottom. You then suck out all the water and it gets sucked down into the sea bottom. And the advantage of that is there's no banging, which is noisy to the communities and also potentially harmful to the marine environment. It's also, when we demonstrated that, the installation time was 7 hours, which was almost half of the installation time of traditional foundations. So real step changes can be made. The self-installing wind turbine, which I think didn't progress much beyond this point, and then Keystone Engineering's, they have a twisted jacket. The idea there is rather than 4 legs, you have 3, but you get similar structural integrity by twisting it, but you lose a leg and therefore a quarter of the steel cost for the legs. And then the last one, this then is Dong Energy. They combined the twisted with the suction bucket, best of both worlds. So you can see that getting installed out there in the North Sea. The critical point I hear is it's getting craned out into the North Sea. When it hits the water, you want to have a lovely day like that. When it's wavy, it's a bit challenging, but the suction bucket, you engage that as soon as it's hitting the water. That helps stabilize things as well, and it effectively sucks itself all the way down as you lower it into the seabed there. So, in summary, this is ultimately what we need. We need to have steel and concrete being installed, and we need to have a path and roadmaps to achieving that. The way to do that is to have international collaboration, because no one country can do this together. We need to have the right people around the table. Hopefully Onassis will help on that. And then we need new modes of collaboration to go beyond roadmaps to real demonstration and ultimately to mass scale deployment. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Is this actually real, or is this just a new Meccano kit you've got up there? It's absolutely fascinating stuff. Well, one thing that you may or may not know about Imperial is that for a long time it's been among the leading institutions in the UK on solar cells, and we're delighted to have to respond to that latest talk. One of the current Imperial pioneers, Jenny Nelson, who's Professor of Physics here, and also leads the Grantham Institute mitigation team. So, and then we'll have a short break after Jenny's talk. Jenny.
Thanks. Okay, so I'm audible. Thank you, Richard, for the introduction, and thank you, Tom, for the very nice overview of energy systems and technology development. So Tom has made the point very clearly that the energy system is complex, and that we anticipate a variety of transitions in the technologies that will be used and in the way that they will be used in meeting low carbon energy scenarios in the future. One of the things that we've been doing in the Grantham Institute, in the mitigation team, is using energy systems models to try to forecast the contributions that to try to forecast how different parts of the energy system will be met in a future which is compatible with the minimal increase in global temperature. And what I've got here are results for our forecasts for how the electricity capacity will be met in a 2 degrees scenario. These were obtained through a project called Avoid 2, which has been done in collaboration with the Met Office and is looking particularly at the nature of energy transitions. And the point I would make here is that when we look at how what the electricity system in this case will look like in 2050, we see that it will look different from today, and it's going to involve a variety of different technologies. And if you use a different model to look at that question, you'll come up with a slightly different answer. But in every case, it's necessary to invoke technologies which are not yet fully mature. The situation is the same if we look at other parts of the energy system. If we look at the case of energy for transport, for industry, or for buildings, in every case, when we see how things are likely to change in a low-carbon future, we see a diversification of the energy technologies in each of those sectors. For example, we see in the case of both transport and industry a greater role for transport and buildings and industry, a greater role for electrification. And we see sort of key technologies playing a role here, such as electric vehicles, such as carbon capture and storage, for example, in industry, which are not yet deployed on the massive scale. So if we sort of accept that we're going to be working with, we anticipate using technologies which are, maybe they're known now, but not demonstrated on the large scale that we anticipate they'll be needed, or perhaps they're not fully developed yet. I have here a few examples of emerging technologies that would be kind of key to that future picture. That is not exhaustive, there are more, but I've picked examples where there's quite intense research going on in Imperial College, and examples where there's also quite a strong engagement between the researchers in the departments who are looking at these different problems associated with these technologies and with the Grantham Institute. And if we were to look at what are the factors that have inhibit the application of technologies in these different areas to date, we would see a number of different factors. So in the different cases, the situation is slightly different, but in most cases we see that the cost of the technology as available today is an impediment. In many cases we haven't yet had deployment at a large enough scale, both to sort of bring about the changes in behaviour and in infrastructure that would be necessary to enable a shift. And we also see that the system is complex. Renewables can be enabled if you have some combination of electricity storage and sort of intelligent demand management available to make renewables to sort of take up the variability in supply of renewables. And all of that is possible, but it's a problem with different parts that need to be studied together. So if we were to try to, we can sort of identify for each technology a different maybe limiting factors, but there are common themes, being both the cost of the technology as available today, and the issues of demonstration, deployment, and the infrastructure and business models that will be necessary to make them an everyday part of life. So what are we doing about it? Well, I've picked here two examples, and the first one is really the goal of trying to develop tools that we can use to try to evaluate different energy technologies. I picked the example of electricity storage because that's something which, for me, as Richard mentioned, my area is solar PV. For solar PV to make a really big contribution to electricity supply, we need electricity storage. And when we talk to the experts, we find that for grid-connected storage, there is as yet no consensus on what class of storage technology will dominate. Will it be cheaper batteries? Will it be mechanical systems like pumped hydro and compressed air? So as yet we don't know. And then there's a question of how you can identify the winners. One thing that's necessary to do to sort of help with this is to find a way to model the role, the contribution that storage can make in an energy system model which takes into account both very fast, very fine time resolution and a sufficiently fine spatial resolution, so that you can evaluate different different types of technology in a real situation. And that's something which there's currently a research project focused on. And then we can use such energy, such improved modelling tools to then evaluate the contribution that storage technologies can actually make to mitigation. The other example is one not so much of developing tools to evaluate technologies, but it's an example of a basic research project that's going on in Imperial. I'm not going to talk in detail about what's on the slide, but simply give this, it's a research council funded project, and it's led by my colleague Ned Eakins-Dawkes, who was originally recruited by the Grantham Institute as a lecturer in 2007, and he got together with engineers who are experts in refrigeration cycles to think about the question how you could bring together know-how in solar PV and the function of heat pumps to try to design a system that would be able to meet at the same time demands in heat, for cooling, and for electricity, using a hybrid system which is then able to adapt to the changes in heat and energy supply through the year. And this is an example. I bring it up because it's sort of showing, although no single component in that diagram is something which is completely new, putting it together to address a problem in energy supply is something which is relatively new. It's a chance for innovation and for people, sort of like an opportunity to find solutions to problems. So my last point then, we're often asking ourselves the question and trying to answer the question of, if you want to sort of bring about these new technologies which are essential to a low carbon system, is it more important to invest in research and development to bring down the cost in the lab? Is it more important to invest in deployment schemes where you can increase the market and then, you know, create the incentive for various players involved in production and supply and installation of the technologies to find cleverer, cheaper ways of doing it? And if we look at the case of solar PV, which is where I come from, then the answer is that really both are important. If we look at the evolution of the cost and the market size in solar PV, to begin with, research and development was important in improving efficiency, bringing down costs. But the huge majority of cost reductions that we've seen in solar PV have come about as a result of innovations that were stimulated by experience in the market. So we think that R&D is important. Of course, it's very important to us in Imperial College, but it's not enough. We also need to think about deployment in stimulating deployment to enable innovation in the real world. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jenny. What a fascinating tour d'horizon of what is a very, very deep and complex and multifaceted issue. We're now going to take a short break. We are slightly behind time, but even so, I suggest that we do try to reconvene at the appointed time of 5:25, and then we'll have time enough to have a really good discussion at the end after the last two presentations.
Right, I'll pop it next to you, Richard, and we say
Okay,
next to
excellent.
11 seconds.
Are you all right with your presentation, Hugh?
Yeah,
Is it,
it's behind that one.
Okay.
Unless you want me to put it up now, do you?
No, whatever you like, whatever you prefer. Yeah. Well, welcome back, everyone. Hope you've had a cup of tea and a coffee. For those of you watching on the webcast, do remember you can tweet in comments and questions that we can take in our question and answer session, which begins in about 25 minutes. The hashtag, once again, is hashtag global_solutions. Now we're concentrating on one of the human dimensions of climate change, specifically health. Some of you might have read about the Lancet Commission on Climate Change and Health that came out earlier in the year. Professor Hugh Montgomery, who's with us, is one of its chairs. But Hugh's one of these people who is really very difficult to describe in a sort of few brief words. You know, Hugh is a polymath. It used to be called a polymath. I think it's probably still are. You know, as well as being an intensive care specialist, he's also heads the UCL Department for Human Health and Performance. He climbs mountains, he runs ultramarathons, he writes children's books, he plays piano underwater. There is nothing this man cannot do. Right, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Never let a journalist near your CV, I think is the message from that one. So firstly, my thanks very much for the invitation. I'm going to try to pull together in 15 minutes quite a lot about health and climate change and its impacts, because very often these issues are framed about polar bears and tree frogs. And whilst I like polar bears and tree frogs, I don't know any socially, and I care much more about people and my family and my children in particular. I'm going to start by framing this as I would as an intensive care doctor, because that's what I do for a living. And when people die on an intensive care unit, which they do, it's sometimes because something massive and catastrophic has hit them out of the blue, but in the vast majority of cases it's not. In the vast majority of cases, these patients have accumulated a burden of illness over time that's weakened them and made them vulnerable, and then it just takes one more hit for them to collapse and die, and we can't fix that problem then. So I'm going to start for the first 6 or 7 minutes just by framing the what we've perhaps heard a little bit of already today about the burden of threat to humanity and the environment already. So what's the burden of disease first before we get the second hit? And for that we need to have a little bit of an understanding of the human condition. So the Earth appeared, we think, somewhere around 4.2 billion years ago. Multi-celled life turned up somewhere around 540 million years ago. Humans appeared probably around 160,000 years ago, and it took until around 1804 for the first billion of us to appear. It took only 123 years to get the next billion. It took 33 years to get the next billion. It took 14 to get to the next, and we now add another billion every 11 to 13 years. We bust through 7. We've added another 400 million people since 2011, and we're still going up. The problem, though, isn't just the numbers of people, it's what we're all doing. And you can look at that in terms of GDP, because every dollar spent is underpinned by something. Some resource is being used, there's some activity. Tin is being mined, phosphates being used, water's being pumped, but something is happening related to that dollar of GDP. And if we go back to 1804, the same sort of time as humanity reached its first billion, world GDP was around $175 billion, $1990. And only a couple of hundred years later, we seem to have risen steeply. We're now knocking 75 trillion of those dollars. So whilst population's gone up by a factor of 7, GDP in the world has gone up by many hundreds of fold, which tells you that every one person is consuming and using one hell of a lot more. And we could look at a bunch of metrics, but one that challenges most of us in health relates simply to issues of food. So if we think of issues of food, we're using around 140 billion kilograms of fish a year for those 7 billion people. That's around approaching 20 kilograms of fish per man, woman and child on the planet, and that's going up very steeply. But people don't want to just live on fish, they want meat as they get more affluent. And so we're now consuming 300 billion kilograms of meat, and that's going up steeply. That's every single year. We're having to feed the cows and grow the grain. We're over 2.25 trillion kilograms of grain every year, and that's continuing to go up as well. And that sort of resource requires a lot of material. It requires soil. And when you till soil, whether it be with a mechanical device linked to a horse or linked to a tractor, you lose around 1% of that topsoil a year. It gets broken up and blown away. That's just a function of it. 1% a year. So think of all the areas of the world that have had crops grown on them for approaching 100 years, and you're getting close to working out how much land will no longer be able to grow anything at all. It works out that because agriculture is quite intensive and we eat a lot, that for every meal in the Western world you eat every day, 10 kilograms of topsoil is irrevocably lost. Now, if you're destroying land and you're going to find new stuff, and the demand for food is going up very steeply, and you're already growing stuff on places you can grow stuff, you've got to start looking for new places. And that's what's really leading us to deforest. Currently 130 trillion square meters of rainforest a year. It doesn't take long to work out that that is not sustainable. Neither is the fact that all of that agriculture, or not all of it, but a very large part of it, is underpinned by the drainage of fossil aquifers, which refill over geological timescales. So that's everywhere from the Ogallala Aquifer in America, underpinning grain production in 8 states, to many other parts of Southeast Asia, to China, where the Hai River is supplemented by a fossil aquifer. When that goes dry, that's grain for 120, or rice for 120 million people will stop being produced. And the North China Plain, where the same applies, but that will be the wheat production for over 640 million people will stop when that aquifer runs dry. So we're facing a massive convergence of problems just relating to food, and we could put that in many other contexts as well. In the meantime, all that human activity and the pollution it creates and the loss of habitat that goes with it is destroying our natural world. And you are living through the biggest mass extinction and the fastest mass extinction this planet has ever seen. So since 1970, we've lost half of all vertebrates on the planet, and 75% of all freshwater vertebrates have gone. And since we've been talking here today, somewhere around 14 species have become completely extinct, because we now have around 8 species an hour becoming extinct. Now, you may wonder why I'm putting this to you at the minute, but the point is we're balanced upon the top of a very, very delicate pyramid, and we're hacking away at the base. And if we continue to do that, that pyramid will collapse and we'll go with it. So that's the burden of disease the planet faces already, on top of which comes climate change. Just to give you the numbers of what we're doing now, because they are astronomical, we're currently burning, and these are last year's data, 166,000 litres of oil, 250,000 kilograms of coal, and 108 billion litres of gas. And we're doing that every second. Right? Massive amounts of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas going to very thin atmosphere, the concentration rising steeply, and we must remember those gases stay a long time. So 7% of the CO2 we emit today will still be warming our planet in 100,000 years' time. That's going to have very big impacts on human health, especially when it synergizes with the threats which I've already described to you. And those threats of climate change come in a number of different forms. Now, most of them sound relatively benign, and I have to say I'm not sure they're very big ticket items. Aeroallergens change. We're seeing that with ragweed pollen and so forth, so there's more asthma. As you get forest fires, you get more particulate pollution. Ozone, granular level ozone change, that's a photochemical effect of heat, which isn't good for pulmonary or cardiovascular disease. We get more algal blooms, which are toxic in oceans. We get more nitrates getting washed down into rivers, which are poisonous and carcinogenic. We get sewage mixing with water with floods, which causes diarrhea. We get more rapid bacterial growth as temperatures warm, which is why you get dodgy tummies in warm climates. The salmonella just breeds a bit faster. And you get big changes in vector-borne diseases. So if you take something like dengue, it's transmitted by a malarial parasite. As climate changes, the place those mosquitoes can live, can expand in their habitat. As it gets warmer, those mosquitoes breed faster. They feed more vigorously and more often. The parasite replicates faster in them, and the burden of dengue rises, which is why China has attributed its current outbreak of dengue, the biggest in its recorded history, to climate change. On top of that, though, come the real big ticket items, and that relates to the fact that climate change is actually about weather change. When you put energy into the climate system, which we're currently doing at the energy equivalent of 5 Hiroshima bombs a second into our climate system, that will increase the frequency and severity of extreme weather events, and it has. And that leads to loss of habitation, it leads to poverty, it leads to loss of crops and starvation, which synergizes with sea level rise and all the other effects I've described. And when you get poverty, loss of habitation and starvation, you get social impacts such as migration and war, again, which we know exist already and are attributable to climate change. So that's why it matters to us. Now, in my last few minutes, then, I'm going to take you through the transition we've tried to make in the health community, and with Virginia Murray, who's sitting, will speak shortly, perhaps in questions, in addressing what we do about the risk. Because this threat is absolutely urgent and it's immediate. I view it as a health emergency, as we all do, and if I get someone who is critically unwell in my emergency department, I don't hold 40 annual case conferences about it, because the patient will be long dead before then. I reach for the technologies I can deploy right now, and I start taking action. So that's what the Lancet Commission, this one was about. The first in 2009 mapped the health impacts. This one was what could we do about it? It was multidisciplinary. It had engineers, social scientists, political scientists, energy economists, technologists, financiers, and others. And it was multinational. You see some of the representative British universities there, but the key others were in Sweden, but also Tsinghua in China. So this was a genuine equal partnership. This was not a UCL initiative. I happened to work there, but this was a proper, genuine partnership. It was based upon the fact that we already had described the climate change in 2009 as the greatest global health threat of the 21st century. And the first work we did mapped, again, why that might be. Now, I put up this infographic because it's in the Lancet Commission report. It's free to download. And what this is meant to show you is that the health impacts I described to you earlier do not happen in little siloed boxes. They interact in incredibly wicked ways, where multiple pathways end up having the same sorts of impacts. You can see there are many ways in which climate change is affecting biodiversity and crops. There are many ways in which we're getting effects on respiratory health, on cardiovascular health, mental health, nutritional health, direct toxins, and a raft of ways in which they interact to produce these social factors, which have always historically been the major drivers of ill health in the world. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, the migration, poverty, disease, plague, pestilence, famine, and so forth. So I'd encourage you to dissect that at your leisure, free, by just clicking on a Lancet link online. But the next work we did was to model whether the risk predictions are right. And actually what we found was that risk has been grossly underestimated. So if you thought what I told you earlier was bad news, it was a heck of a lot worse when we looked at it more closely. And I'll take you through just a couple of images for that. So if we look at just heat waves and just flooding or extreme flooding events, this one's the heat waves. Previous risks had really said, well, what's global average rise in temperature, and mapped that around the world. And they'd been based on the fact that the temperature was averaged out everywhere and assumed that everyone lived in a rather average distribution. And of course, it's not true. People don't live on oceans, and the temperature rises on land are different from those in oceans. So if you then look again at what happens with heat waves, in the places where people actually live, not where they don't live, and then you actually map in for the next 100 years, not a static population that's unchanging, but a growing population with migration into cities, and you map in the demographic change of people, in this case, vulnerable to heat, particularly those over the age of 65, you found somewhere between a 6 and 11-fold underestimate of exposure risk. The previous exposure risk on modelling being the blue line, the actual realistic exposure risk being the red line. And you can see the same in this case for drought in the bottom right-hand corner. Again, I'm going quick because we want to get to discussion, but you can dissect these data yourselves, should you wish, online. I thought the talk we heard earlier on, actually, in the last session, both talks, were superb. And there's no doubt at all that the challenge is there to create new technologies and to work out how the heck to put them together to make them work. But the conclusion from the technologists we got there was at least the technologies do exist to be deployed now to make a substantial dent in that risk. It's not that we're waiting for 20 years, scratching our beards for someone to come up with an answer. We can do something about this right now. There isn't a golden bullet we're waiting for in 15 or 20 years' time. That's not to abrogate the need for intensive research and development opportunities now, but it is to say we can get on and deploy stuff right now if we have the will. The other interesting thing that came out from the economists working in these three countries was that this is affordable. I had the idea there was some massive lack of money in the world. It turns out there isn't a lack of money in the world. There's plenty of it about trying to find a place to go. And the amounts required aren't actually huge. So the modelling matches that others have produced, which is one could likely get on and solve this problem by deploying somewhere around $1 trillion globally a year. Now, to put that in context, that's only 18% of what's spent globally on health anyway. Right? So if you view this as a health prevention measure, you're only asking to add 18% to the total budget. And it's a very small fraction, actually, of the amount of money that's spent on developing new grid technologies and so forth and deploying fossil fuel-related energy systems and maintaining those that currently exist. So in real terms, it's not actually a huge amount of money. And furthermore, you get a lot of it back because it turns out that low-carbon living is enormously healthy. So a couple of quick examples. Cows belch methane 23 times as potent greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. That's bad for the climate. But for we white males living in Britain, bowel cancer is our commonest cause of death now. And the major attributable cause of that cause of death is red meat consumption. So if I stop eating red meat, it's good for my climate, it's good for a lot of other things. It also happens to be good for my risk of dying of cancer. And it's good for the healthcare costs related to my CT scans, surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, the fact I can no longer contribute to my economy. If we start using active transport, cycling and walking as opposed to fossil fuels, enormous gains in bone mineral density, falls, muscle strength, mental health, cardiovascular health, strokes, cardiovascular disease, and at least 2 forms of cancer, breast cancer in women, bowel cancer in men. And those gains are very quick. So health gearing is tight. If you look at another example of stopping smoking in public places, that's not a climate change issue, but you could measure the health economic gains within 3 months of that happening. Very tight gearing, immediate gains. So we've explained why there'd be some health economic benefits. The scale of them is pretty good. If you go to getting rid of coal, for instance, and the particulates it produces, you save around 38 billion euros a year in Europe by 2030 in health costs. And globally, a 36% change to renewables estimated to save around $250 billion a year, which goes quite a long way to offsetting the costs of their deployment. The final points and conclusions, therefore, were that actually we know that we've got a challenge. We've got to address it immediately, but this isn't anymore predominantly a technical or economic issue. It's a political one. We need people to decide to take action at every level. We felt that these are the actions which should be taken. We need immediate introductions of carbon levies, bans on coal plants and so forth, moving of renewables, and a real deal in Paris at the end of the year, not a fake deal. Low carbon cities, and the breakdown of silos, which I think has been very well exemplified by the meeting today so far. We need engineers talking to social scientists and anthropologists and doctors and others. And the final thing is I'm hoping that you are all interested, and that's why you're here, as opposed to the fact someone sent you, because we do have stuff to do here, and we have personal, political, professional, and indeed, if any of you in the audience, profit-related reasons for taking significant action. And I'd leave you with the one other P at the top end, that's a personal one, about why we're interested, because it is about people, and people aren't just bipeds out there. They're you and me, and they're our wives, husbands, girlfriends, boyfriends, partners, and children. Because if this goes wrong, it's going to go wrong very badly. This from the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, making the point that a 4-degree future, for all the reasons I've described, especially when they're synergised with all those global threats to environment I've already discussed, are incompatible with an organised global community, that's the society we currently understand, are not possible to be adapted to. will be devastating to ecosystems. And an interim to much, much higher temperature levels. Things don't just plateau off at these temperatures. They're an interim to much higher levels. Are we on that path? Well, the answer is we are. We're on the RCP 8.5 curve. We're actually above the RCP 8.5 for emissions, which means that if you're under 30 or you've got a child under 30, they're going to get hit by this, even if there were no other threat to the environment, and there are those threats such that we've discussed. So that's where I'm going to stop. I hope I've not run over my 15 minutes, and I think we're moving to discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Hugh. And to respond for that, we have as our next speaker Professor Paolo Vines, who's the chair in environmental epidemiology here at Imperial and an affiliate at the Grantham Institute. I have to thank Paolo for teaching me a new word today. After genomics and proteomics and metabolomics, we now have exposonomics, which is all about the total of exposure that the body has, internal and external, when markers of disease come along. So, Paolo, please.
Sorry, but you didn't learn it correctly, because it is exposomics. So I'm going to expand one of the topics addressed by Hugh, which is the so-called co-benefits. What does it mean? Well, essentially, in addition to climate change, humankind is now facing another big threat, which is the increase in non-communicable diseases, which might become a nightmare in the next decades. And the only solution for that is prevention, because really the world is unable to address the increase in non-communicable diseases only through diagnosis and treatment. We have to address it through prevention. The philosophy of co-benefits means that by mitigating climate change, you also get a co-benefit in the field of health. We heard that from Hugh, and I have a few examples. Urban transport is obvious because if people are encouraged to use bicycles and to walk more, and we reduce the use of cars, we have an advantage in terms of emissions, and we have an advantage in terms of reduction of obesity. Obesity is now really a big problem. Diabetes is strongly associated with obesity. Both are becoming extremely highly prevalent in our societies and in the world overall. So people have estimated that if the use of bicycles and walking are encouraged, we might be able to prevent between 10 to 20% of infarctions and strokes. It doesn't sound much, but we can do better if slowly we substitute cars with other ways of moving around. And now only 2% of the trips in London are by bicycle. Second problem is air pollution. Air pollution is huge in the world, both outdoor and indoor. It is an issue in particular in developing countries where the use of stoves, the use of wood and dung and other organic matter in stoves and for heating and for cooking leads to the exposure of a lot of people to particles. And overall, outdoor and indoor pollution are responsible for about 3.5 to 4 million premature deaths in the world. So we have good examples of initiatives to tackle this problem. For example, in India, they have substituted old stoves with new stoves in as many as 150,000 households. And this is estimated to lead to a reduction of 15 times of exposure to particles, by 15 times. So the impact on health may be enormous, but it is also an impact on the environment and climate change. Among the different consequences of exposure to air pollution, there is also lung cancer. This is just to refer to our own research at Imperial College. This is a large study we have done in about 1 million Europeans, which shows that clearly air pollution is associated with an increased risk of lung cancer. And this occurs at the current levels, not levels of the past, in Europe. You refer to Exposomics. This is a big initiative, a big network in Europe led by us at Imperial College to study further the impact of air pollution with omic technologies. The problem of meat has been already mentioned. In fact, reducing the consumption of meat can have, again, a double benefit, because meat is, the production of meat leads to emissions of methane. 1/5 of greenhouse gases are due to meat production. Meat production is very inefficient in terms of energy, but in the meantime, reducing the intake of meat has a lot of health benefits. And in fact, in 3 weeks, I'm going to a meeting of the International Agency for Research on Cancer, where we will evaluate the cancer risks associated with meat intake. So this is essentially the overall message. That is, if we act in a few sectors, which are food, which are transport, heating, and so on, we can have a double benefit. Unfortunately, different institutions, agencies, world organizations work separately, and people have not really realized this advantage of exploiting the double benefit of acting in certain sectors of society. There are also economic benefits, because the cost of treating diabetes, diagnosing and treating diabetes is increasing in an incredible way, and this is also true for other diseases. We simply cannot afford it in the future. So this is an estimate, again from a Lancet paper, of the economic benefits, the savings that could come from prevention of diabetes through increase in physical activity, which means creating the conditions to allow people to do physical activity, not simply in gyms, because poor people do not go to gyms, but enabling them to do physical activity through the structure, a new structure of cities, a new organization of cities. So these are, I believe, some of the challenges, and this could be a kind of unifying philosophy across different sectors, including public health. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, now I'd like to invite all of our 6 speakers to come up to the table, if you would. Hopefully you'll find your own name tag rather than someone else's. And we're going to have, I think we have just about an hour exactly for questions and comments. If you're watching on the webcast, once again, you can send them in, #global_solutions, and we'll do our best to take some of your questions and comments. Now, I think we have microphones for the audience in the room. Is that correct? Roving microphone? No? Okay. Never mind. So what I might do is just repeat your questions then for people who are listening on the webcast. Right, questions, comments. Yes, gentlemen there, please.
Great, guys. My name is Stephen Devenish. I work for the Clinton Foundation, Clinton Climate Initiative, and just like to thank the Grantham Institute for the invite today. I think it's been brilliant. I just want to raise the issue of forestry, probably mainly with Andrew. In the Clinton Foundation, we're struggling to try to restore landscapes through forest restoration. And we've previously been involved with RED programs where we're trying to monetize the carbon and put that money back into management. Hasn't been very successful, and restoration is also very difficult. And when, Andrew, you were talking earlier about local solutions and then global solutions, the problem that I've always faced in forestry, which has been quite a difficult sector to work in because of governance issues and enforcement, is whether it's better to work at a local level or a national level. And I've had different experiences in different countries. In China and Vietnam, it's been very easy to get things done because it's centrally planned. In Indonesia, which is very consensual, it's very difficult. And I just would appreciate your perspective on how we catalyse what level of political, what political level is required to really catalyse this change.
So the question for people on the webcast is really about what level of political engagement in countries, from the national down to the very local, is likely to be most effective and useful when it comes to forest conservation. Andrew.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's complex and variable, as you kind of indicated more or less. And I think the global market's also a big part of the solution. Some of the EU initiatives and so on in that area, I think, are promising. But it depends very much on what the specific drivers of deforestation are in different contexts, whether it's timber or whether it's indeed land clearance for food. So I don't think, and indeed, are you dealing with forests that are owned by governments, or are you dealing with tree cover in mixed environments and so on and so forth? There's a very broad range of things. I think your experience at the Clinton Foundation with a sense that the sort of simple model of RED isn't workable, I think is something that a lot of us also reflect as well. I mean, we need a much broader set of thinking about also how you can invest money in these areas so it reaches people who actually manage local environments and makes a difference to the incentives on the ground. It is about multi-level stuff. Some of it's about the global market, some of it's about national tenure. Do the people who are effectively managing the land in a forest zone, do they have the necessary tenure rights? In much of West Africa, for example, high trees are owned with the chiefly title, while land management occurs with a range of other land use titles. So there's a national political economy, a global political economy, and a local political economy. And I think as of now, we still need to work quite hard to align those. Some of the most promising things, I won't go into this in detail, but I think are around trying to develop local business models that enable people to make money out of the forest, but do it in such a way that it produces, sustainable tree cover or reinforces sustainable tree cover. And I think that's a promising approach.
Where are we going with RED then? Because if you said the simple model isn't really proving workable, and yet RED is one of the things that negotiators and governments have put forward to us repeatedly as being one of the successes of the international regime.
There may be a certain amount of success in terms of agreement at the level of discourse. I think the simple notion that large amounts of money can be transferred to the protection of tree cover, that I think as of yet we haven't found very good ways of making that work. That's my opinion. I'm not a deep specialist in that area, but that's a kind of broad take that we would share, I think.
Great, thank you. There's a lady on the far side, you're about 4 rows back, please. Yeah. Yes, there's no microphone, so just
sorry.
Speak in stentorian fashion.
I wasn't making it in stentorian fashion. First of all, can I thank you very much, Grantham, for inviting me. I too, like the previous questioner, am very interested by what you're achieving. The Grantham Institute is a really precious institute between climate and the environment. I think the comment right at the beginning saying that you're trying to stop people sliding down the bits that we don't know, and Grantham is meant to be the glue between a lot of the science, is really of import. My name is Virginia Murray. I work for Public Health England as the public health consultant in global disaster risk reduction. And a lot of the work that you're talking about is very much disaster concerned. I'm also the Vice Chair of the United Nations International Strategy on Disaster Reduction, Scientific and Technical Advisory Group. We have achieved in 2015 something that you are anxious for that will come through in the climate change agreement. We've already achieved a global agreement ratified by the UN General Assembly on the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030, that magic 15 years that you're all talking about. How do you see the work of Grantham engaging with this, and in particular all your wider partners, but also taking on from Hugh, how do we get you engaged to work at a UN level where we have the global agreement for a science and technology conference, of which I'm the chair of the organising committee, on the implementation of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and its links to the climate change and sustainable development goals. I'd love the comments from those contributors who are sitting behind the table writing.
The three big conferences of the year, the three big climate-related conferences. That's absolutely right. As it was a question about Grantham overall, I'm wondering whether Joe or Martin would want to sort of respond, give some sort of institutional response from that, or.
Well, I mean, clearly the answer is yes. We'd be very interested. We're all ears to what's important and how we can support it. So if you can give us some suggestions of how we can address some such as we will. It's exhaustive and limited, but what we want to do, as you've understood, is get people from different arenas talking to each other, and if we can get some input into policies based on that, that's what we'll try and support.
I can feel a productive conversation over wine coming on later. Walter, is there anything else you'd like to add to that? It's probably closer to your field of expertise than the other two.
Yeah, I think very much second what Joe just said from a more personal perspective. I happen to be working in an area that indeed has very close relation to policy levels. We work with UNESCO in a couple of projects, other policy makers. And I think from just my perspective as a scientist, one of the things we're still struggling with is knowing what kind of products we can produce that really feed into decision making. The default is always a policy paper. Policy papers can be extremely successful, but we like to think that there's more in terms of data sets, websites, interactive visualizations, apps on mobile phones, whatever it is. Of course, as a scientist, we can't make that our full target. We still have to do science and scientific publications as well. But very often, there's a lot of interest and good intentions, but it gets stuck at the point where we really want to think, well, what concretely can we do? Can we produce that a policy maker, that a decision maker will effectively use? So that's kind of a personal plea to those outside of academia to bombard scientists with that as much as they can.
It was remarkable to me how the Sendai conference kind of slid by completely out of the eyes of journalists here, which was remarkable because the Sendai was, of course, one of the cities that was most starkly affected by the tsunami in 2011. So I thought the connection made, but obviously there wasn't. Right, gentlemen, right at the back on this side, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm David Hallam. My day job is Chief Negotiator on Sustainable Development Goals for the Department of International Development of the UK government. Really enjoyed the afternoon presentation. Thank you very much. As you know, the government's going through a spending review, or you may know, the government's going through a spending review at the moment, and it's affecting many of us in lots of ways. We're very fortunate in the international development community that the aid budget is protected, although exactly how that's going to be spent is very much up for grabs. So my question for the panel is, outside of your specific field of expertise or research, where would you like to see the government spending an extra £10 million in the field of international development and climate change?
I think the way we might tackle this is by asking each of you to give a single answer in about 10 seconds. I think that would be quite an apt way to do this, if that's okay with you. Perhaps we could start at the far end, Paola?
Oh, thank you.
That's what's called a hospital pass in the rugby world, but there we are.
Well, first of all, given the challenge we are facing, 10 million, not a large amount of money, frankly. Well, what I see from many points of view, both in research and in implementation and in action, is a lack of cooperation. I see in England, but also outside, a lot of people replicating the same kinds of research, and there is a lack of interest and efforts into translational activities, I would say. In medicine, we call it translational activities. There is a lot we know about the causes of diseases, for example, but what we know is not implemented. And now, for example, we could now prevent about 50% of cancers based on what we know, which is much more than we would be able to cure. So the same might apply to climate change. I mean, what is really missing is not perhaps research, it is implementation and translational efforts. So I would put the money there. I know it is broad and vague, but still it is.
Yes, I think if the other panellists could be slightly less broad and slightly less vague, that would probably be quite a good idea. Hugh.
Okay, so if I read the question right, it's about how we do something about climate change immediately that's going to impact on international development and health. So I agree with what's been said. I think 10 million's too little to save the world on its own. I think the answer to these things is to put it into one place, one small place, get it to work in one small place and produce the recipe that's then readily replicable. So by way of just one quick example, we're starting to take, it's an open invitation to everyone in the room, where we're pulling people together in one region, in Britain to start with, to try to put all the companies together, whether it's battery storage, energy generation, people matching supply and demand, etc., 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 and give them one giant test bed in the real world to get it all working quickly. 10 million quid probably make that happen, actually. It'd probably sort that problem out. And very quickly, you'd find what worked with what. Jenny could have her test beds then left for the new stuff, and whatever's found then gets rapidly cloned and spread worldwide. So that's what I do with the 10 million. If you gave me $1 trillion, I'll do something much bigger.
So, Jenny, Hugh spent 10 million on your test bed. How would you spend 10 million?
Well, the thing that came into my mind when you rephrased the question is the idea of developing, demonstrating clean energy systems for displaced peoples. This is something which is very much in the news at the moment. I know there is a movement on that. But this is an example where it's something which, it's similar to the question of energy systems off-grid, which of course is relevant to renewables. But if you think about how to sort of cope with an increasingly mobile population and how clean energy solutions could be part of how we deal with that, rather than all we refer to in government. So I think I'd put it there.
Thank you. Tom.
So you asked me to pick an area outside of my expertise. There was an interesting report that was done by DEC, but also broad participation, IEA, Imperial, lots of different institutions, looking at 2050 and can the world grow, become more prosperous, and is that compatible with 2 degrees? And for once it was good news. So it concluded that the world on average could live like Europeans do now. So we can't be Americans, but we can be Europeans. And there were 2 key things. One was the energy system, and particularly electricity, and decarbonise that by 9%. The other one was land use and agriculture. And I'm not an expert, so how you use that 10 million is not, but that would be my other focus area.
Yeah, interesting. Walter.
I think I'll also second Paolo, focusing on the translational aspect of research. To come back actually to my former answer about call for ideas of how to stronger link into policy. The very last bit about that was that as scientists we still we only have, of course, limited time to dedicate to outreach to policymakers and others. So one bottleneck I see is ideas, another bottleneck is support with doing that outreach. And I know that there are already a lot of possibilities these days for grants, etc. But I still think that there's a bottleneck or that we as scientists are very much squeezed between supposed to do great science and do so many other activities. So I think supporting scientists in doing that kind of outreach, and ideally by people that are experts in communication and in creating the tools that policymakers use. I see that very much as another bottleneck, and further support in really making the science work on the ground, I think, is essential there.
Thanks. And Andrew, looking outside your immediate field, where would you put 10 million?
Yeah, great question. I put it into shaping functional, urban, low-carbon, healthy and equitable environments in Africa by linking up communities and also developing planning capacity. Many of the places urban environments are growing, there's basically zero capacity to organise anything, and certainly not to shape a functional. And that's where you lock in carbon over hundreds of years, not just short periods.
Yeah, this is one of the points that the New Climate Economy report made so starkly, wasn't it? That within the next 15 years, if you build high carbon infrastructure, then you lock in a high carbon world. If you build low carbon infrastructure, you go some way to solving the problem. Gentleman over this side with a very smart red tie.
Well, I'm Bennett Northcote. I'm the Director of Corporate Responsibility at John Lewis Partnership, which encompasses both John Lewis and Waitrose. I wanted to ask a question around on the public health side and the questions of the absolutely compelling evidence around the health benefits of sustainable and healthy lifestyles, which is obviously overwhelming as everybody looks at it. The question is those pesky consumers themselves and what they choose. We know that it's bad to eat a bad diet already, but we're still getting obese and eating a bad diet.
Yeah.
From your public health experience, what are the drivers that will change those behaviours? Because we talk about behaviour change, it's thrown around a lot, really hard to do without totalitarian measures, say let's just put up the cost of cigarettes and ban you from smoking and things like that. What are the public health measures that might help and move to more healthy and sustainable lifestyles?
So for those of you watching on the webcast, the question is about well, really, there may be lots of good evidence why moving to a healthier diet would be a good idea, but it's not necessarily that not necessarily something that people themselves, the people eating the diet, are very readily doing. So, what can we learn from public health practices that could help in this way? There's probably one for Hugh and Paolo, I think.
Well, I'm happy to start. I'm not a public health physician per se, but I've obviously got some knowledge of this field. The answer actually probably, in my view, does come down to legislation, actually, because what we do know is that education in these things doesn't work. Humans are very, very badly wired for changing behaviours for any activity that's immediately pleasurable based on some indeterminate risk somewhere down the line. So you can educate people all you like about the risks of alcohol, unprotected sex, cigarettes, or drug use, and advertising campaigns make no difference at all to those things, which is why every single government doesn't spend much on it. They do enough to put a few adverts up to make us all think they're doing something, but they know they could triple the budget or multiply it by 100 and it won't work, because when it comes down to those pleasurable activities, people will continue to do them. If you're faced with food that is bad for you but is really cheap, readily available, and really tasty, which a lot of food that's bad for you really is, you will consume it, I will consume it, and so will you. And telling me that it's really bad for me will not change the fact that you'll buy a muffin and a cappuccino that size on the way to work or whatever, because it's much more tasty. And Japan's facing that. Given a choice between a branded cappuccino and a bun or pickled fish, which are you going to go for? And people are going to go for that. And you can't compete with the budgets for advertising and marketing that's already there. So in my view, that's an expensive, ineffective way to go. It's the same with transport. You can tell people till you're blue in the face they've got to walk and cycle, but if it's dirty and dangerous, they're not going to do it. If you make it cheap and easy and quick and efficient and safe and more pleasurable than the alternative, they'll do it in droves. That requires legislation about transport infrastructure and urban planning, which is out with the control of the consumer. So that's where I'll be putting my money.
Thanks. Paolo, have you got any other insights on this?
I completely agree. I'm afraid that this kind of message has gone out of the academia, because if you look at the United Nations strategy for non-communicable diseases, it is very much focused on individual intervention and health promotion, health education, whereas it is very clear from all kinds of research that what is really effective is structural interventions. Taxes for alcohol and cigarettes, and also the prices of food are essential, because it is paradoxical that fruit and vegetables cost more than junk food or other kinds of unhealthy food. So I think that there is a wrong attitude in people who do prevention. They didn't get this lesson of decades of research that structural interventions are those which work, acting on prices, taxes, and so on. Well, there are very good examples, for example, anti-smoking activities in Brazil or in Thailand, and this should be repeated elsewhere. And well, a very good example is what Mayor Bloomberg did in New York. By reducing the size of certain junk foods portions, banning trans fatty acids, and a number of other things. That, however, attracted a lot of criticism in the name of the freedom of choice. So also this philosophy of the freedom of choice needs to be addressed and criticized, because well, people talked about paternalism when Bloomberg proposed or banned trans fatty acids, but probably this is the only way.
Perhaps I can bring Andrew Norton in here as well, because it seems to me we may be missing a trick here in thinking about sort of food as in one national market. You know, if we have a case, for example, where beef is the main issue and beef is being grown in huge quantities and developed in huge quantities in Brazil and Argentina, for example, and that is having an impact on the rainforest, then presumably there's something that can be done effectively at that end of the supply chain, with whether it's land rights, whether it's payment for ecosystem services, so you don't actually turn land to pasture, that kind of thing.
I mean, I think to make a big dent in beef production would take a real transformation in values, attitudes and approaches, which would need to be in this society as well as the producer societies. I mean, you do see a lot of people who ethically give up beef, and it's partly for these reasons about links to local livelihoods in the south, as well as notions of climate change and so on. So I think it'll be one of the test cases, in a way, of popular action and mobilisation.
Thanks.
One more point on this, especially if we've got Waitrose in the room. So obviously, solution does require fundamental changes to our diet, but there are a lot of benefits within categories. So before we ban beef, and I think you all know this, there's a very big difference between low carbon and high carbon beef, depending on what you feed the cattle. For tomatoes, a big difference between tomatoes grown in a heated greenhouse in the UK or seasonally, even if we have to ship them in. The Carbon Trust has led on carbon footprinting, which obviously now has become widespread in the market. My personal view is choice editing by the retailers within categories has also could have a very large impact.
Great. Another question. Jo Coleman, please.
Yeah, thanks. Jo Coleman from the Energy Technologies Institute. I'd like to just pull together kind of comments from Tom, Jen and Hugh, and then pose back a question. It's probably more to you than anybody else. You built on the fact that, or basically you drew the conclusion that innovation is critically important, but that we need to get on with deployment. And Hugh made the point, and I totally agree, that the technologies we need are available today, and I think it's often under-recognised. They are available today and they are affordable. And I think the messages we're giving about innovation are potentially confusing politicians and giving them this idea that we should wait for the silver bullet, that there's something better just around the corner, and And typically we know when we innovate, when we promise to innovate and promise to do things, typically it takes longer and it's more challenging than we think it will be. Not, obviously there are occasional breakthroughs, but we can never be sure where they'll be. So my question to you really is, are we overplaying the role of innovation? We know we can reduce costs and improve performance, but are we just, is it almost fighting against us now in that it's causing delays?
So for those of you on the webcast, the question is around messages on innovation. It takes longer to innovate than people assume. So on the one hand, ministers may be getting messages that we need to wait for innovation. That would be a wise thing to do. On the other hand, there is the initiative to the reasons for deploying what we have right now. Jenny, would you like to take that first?
Sure, I'm happy to give the first stab at the answer. So I certainly wouldn't, and I hope I wasn't giving the message that we need to wait for innovation. I think if we take the example of where I have more experience, which is in solar PV, when you look at what has happened, there has been innovation all along the way ever since the first ideas about how to reduce the sort of recombination losses within the solar cell up to what's happening today or what's been happening recently in terms of manufacture processes. And I think a lot of the innovation processes that have brought down the cost of solar panels have been ones that happened because the technology was out there and there were opportunities, commercially rewarding opportunities for the companies involved to find a clever way to do things and to bring down the costs. So I think my point would be for the technologies which, so of course many technologies can be improved, but I think they can be improved and there will be more chances and more ways to improve them if the incentives are there to deploy them and to continue to support deployment in a consistent way.
Well, just to pick up on Joe's point, maybe there's some confusion around what's actually meant by innovation, because innovation can be something in a factory process that shaves 5% off the cost of a solar panel. On the other hand, innovation can be molten salt reactors, which clearly have a huge different time scale and you're talking about huge different levels of investment and so on.
It doesn't need to be technology, and arguably we're lacking some of the business model and policy innovation required to get technologies into the market.
Tom, would you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so I totally agree, as Joe probably know. And I think building on it, there are some quite dangerous discussions kind of along that lines. And I think what they're missing is, and I think what we need is industry to talk, and the problem is industry looks self-interested. But and when we talk about the balance between push, R&D support and pull or subsidies, industry, when we talked about the investment needed in R&D, most of it's going to be from industry. From every £1 for government, you need 3 from industry. Industry is not going to invest if there's not a market. Now, unfortunately, for a lot of these technologies, they're not cost effective, so you have to subsidise it. But subsidies have become a bit of a dirty word. But you have to be very dangerous, because you start lowering those and there's no market, and then you don't get your £3 for the government investment. And that message just seems to be lost. But the industry looks self-interested, so I don't know how you get over that problem. But we do need industry. One, I guess, to give confidence the costs that can come down, and of course they have in PV. And then through very open communication and without over-promising, shout very loudly that you can't do this in a lab solely, you need to have the market.
Innovation through deployment. Just before I come to Hugh, can I just ask Tom and Jenny a rather cheeky question? The Apollo project, distraction or worthwhile?
I think it's worthwhile. Again, you have to be careful with these messages, and certainly it's not pausing deployment to go to innovation. But there is a lack, as I said, there is duplication of effort from R&D. We do need to have a step change. And the nice thing about Apollo, it is they're talking about short time periods. So we're not talking about putting us on for 10, 20, 30 years. The whole point is not to be that we have a critical time period, put on the accelerator, the opposite to not do so.
Cool. Hugh.
So I'll just echo you. We obviously, I completely agree, and I agree with what's been said before. We've got to get on and deploy this stuff now. And we did pull a meeting together earlier in the year with a couple of 100 people in each of the sectors, and it was surprising to me how little they talked to each other before. And they hadn't been able to work out where the barriers were to their own deployments. When we did put them together, it became quite clear. Everyone was talking about the problem of baseload and the problem that comes from renewables when using fuel when you don't need it. The mapping made it quite clear you can do efficiency things to mean the demand's less. You can do some really clever things about using white goods, and for instance having your washing machine set to go off sometime between 8 o'clock and 5 o'clock this afternoon, and if you link it up with some weather mapping you can actually get it switched on in swathes when the sun's going to shine or when the wind's going to blow and so forth. There's some clever stuff on energy storage, and there's some interesting stuff about making fuel. You know, if you're going to fry the grid, you can electrolyse water, produce hydrogen, and find a way of coating the pipes to ship it around the place. What's now needed is to put all those people in one place, and I couldn't agree more. This can't be done in the lab. We've got to get these companies in one place, playing with each other, because they're not competitors actually. They're all got something to bring to the table to actually just work out how it works in the real world. And it needs to start happening now. And that's something a government could do.
Great. Thank you very much. We had a few hands up. The gentleman, yes, in the grey suit there, please.
Particularly stimulated by Hugh's fantastic use of statistics earlier on. I'm the British ambassador to the OECD and the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development and the International Energy Agency. And they, amongst other things, primarily measure. They generate data, they measure, they analyse, and they put it out there. Could I perhaps ask more of all panellists if there was something that you could get the OECD to measure, perhaps to the same extent that they measure and make a big deal of GDP employment rates currently, that you think would solve or go a long way to help you solve the problem? What would be the most important thing that you would like to see measured more and better?
So for those of you on the webcast, the question came from the UK ambassador to the OECD, and the question is: if the OECD were to measure something other than GDP and employment, which it does now, what would you like the OECD to be measuring? So to some extent, we're in the whole area of other indicators of societal progress. Who'd like to have a stab at this one?
I guess one change of perspective that's required, because obviously I'd say we need to measure carbon, but still in the UK and most countries, whenever there are carbon targets, it's carbon targets within the country. So we have this border around the UK, and that's where we focus on, and we say, oh, we need to reduce our carbon emissions. But of course, every year we manufacture more and more the products that we buy in China, in other countries, and so we're effectively exporting our carbon. And then this also then links obviously with all the international carbon agreements. So we did a piece of work on this, looking at the carbon flows of trade around the world, and by getting better indicators on every £1 of trade spent, how much carbon associated it, you can see those carbon flows around the world and what's being exported and imported. And then the next question is then how do you then control that? And that's much harder. But if we could have a good picture for the trade of carbon and how much as we offshore industry, the impact that's happening, I think that will change. It needs to change the discourse that's happening politically.
So you've also got these other composite measures, haven't you, of human progress that sort of integrate, GDP with health and well-being and sometimes even happiness. I mean, any of you excited by those? Would you like to see the OECD be publishing every year on how we're doing against those? Go on, Hugh.
I'm not quite sure what to say about this. I mean, I have to say that I'd written down the same answer. I'm not sure that we need a new measurement, but a new presentation. So CO2 per dollar of GDP is a very, very useful tool. And I forget, I was just about to start doing the maths on a piece of paper to come up with a number, but you can do it yourselves, about how much CO2 in terms of kilograms is for every dollar or pound we spend. It's when you look at it in those terms that you realise we're not looking at minor shavings and efficiency here. We're looking at absolutely fundamental change. So just changing the units, I think, are important. In terms of the other things, yes. I mean, dollars, as we know, are totally dissociated from happiness, and beyond a certain level, they're pretty dissociated from health. So, and the interesting part for me, for those of you who know the famous graph, looking at it from your perspective, dollars per GDP going that way, happiness that way, and there's a sort of spread of dots that goes up here, and after a certain point, the more you've got per capita, happiness isn't any better. But for me, the interesting part's in the ascending limb, because there are populations that are almost as poor as any in the world, that are as happy as any in the world, and some that are as rich as any in the world, who are as unhappy as anyone. Which that's what we've got to be starting to address, I think, in the future. And obviously the carbon and the environmental part of that is a strong part of it. But we shouldn't be just worshipping the dollar, we should be worshipping what that means to humanity behind it, I think.
Great. Well, if anyone else has any ideas, I suggest you see the ambassador at the end here. Gentleman on the end of the row over here. Yeah.
So I had a comment.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, just hang on. Yeah, Paula, please.
A kind of response to your interesting question. A problem we face in the study of health is that usually we have a pretty crude indicators, both concerning the outcomes and the determinants. And there is a whole sector which is unexplored, which is social cohesion, for example, empowerment of communities. And my feeling is that first, this is quite important for health. It is important for resilience towards climate change or whatever. And it is changing quickly because of the pace of change in society. For example, new poverty and increasing social inequalities lead to a decrease in social cohesion, less empowerment of local communities, which mean a lot in terms of resilience. So if you can also consider this kind of indicators, maybe based on surveys and not necessarily on a regular basis. That would be a great contribution.
Interesting. And Andrew Norton?
Yeah, just a quick word that the Social Progress Index is quite good, actually. Some work that's been done on that, building on, obviously, governance indicators. It looks at accountability, social cohesion, human security, equity, a range of things, gender equality. So I think that's worth looking at, and it exists. The other thing I would say, building on the back of what's coming with the SDGs and the part of the Sustainable Development Goals that relate very much to developed countries. I mean, there are a number, the equality one and others, but I think some kind of composite metric around the sustainable consumption goal within that would also be worth looking at.
If memory serves me right, that was in the draft that was prepared by the high-level panel that the Secretary-General put together, but somehow didn't make it through into the SDGs.
No,
is that
sustainable
correct?
consumption is in the SDGs.
Right.
There's an SDG on sustainable consumption and production, but it's still in there.
Fantastic. Dustin Benton, you have the floor.
Thank you. Dustin Benton from Green Alliance. I have a question about the interactions between the development, the medical, and the sort of energy solutions strands we've got here. And I'm going to put it in a slightly parochial way. So analysis that we've done in the UK suggests that about 2/3 of the government's budget is now ring-fenced. And what this means in climate terms is that the organisations like DAC are going to be looking to find money from the health service or perhaps from international development to operationalise some of the co-benefits that we've talked about here. So my question is really, do we have robust frameworks, ways that we make decisions about how to do that? So for example, one thing that's been discussed is why shouldn't the health service pay for insulation for people so that they don't end up in hospital because they're cold and instead they can live in their homes? Great climate benefit, great health benefit. But do we have mechanisms to adjudicate between, for example, the cost of the health service of doing that and, I don't know, cancer care or something that is very emotive and very important? Similar sort of question for international development, but I don't have such a catchy example.
So the issue is, if you have measures that governments can enact that really cut across departmental priorities, such as, for example, providing insulation can be both a climate change and a health benefit? Do we have robust frameworks for making decisions on how the government spends its money? You're kind of asking for joined-up government here, aren't you, Dustin, really? So, I mean, no problem then. Well, I think Professor Montgomery, you're probably best placed to address this one.
No, we don't, and we should. And it's a real problem. It's a real problem. And it's I'm not having popped just at the British government here. And when I talk to other governments, they say exactly the same thing about their own. It's nuts. We've got a common set of solutions here that, if they were implemented, would give us agricultural security, energy security, military security, would improve transport, air quality, health, massively reduce our health costs. Everyone wins, but instead we have departments that are set up to have to fight each other for one budget, with a sort of adjudicated fight going on in the ring adjudicated by the Treasury, and everyone loses by that process. It really wouldn't be that difficult at all to work out one set of common policies where every single department would gain. Any of us in this room could sit down and sort that out in an afternoon. It's not difficult. Those policies are very, very transparently obvious to everybody. And yet we don't do it. So in my sphere, we end up treating an intensive care patient at £3,000 a day, when over a quarter of them will die, so the whole thing is futile in the first place. And in my own experience, I'd say the patients I care for, 95% of those patients in there are there for completely avoidable reasons. And a lot of it can be addressed by the simple discussions and implementation of the policy we've talked about today.
Have you got any ideas for how, how this could be made to, bearing in mind political realities and the fact that government is naturally in silos? Any thoughts that you've had about how one could overcome this?
Yeah, it just takes some leadership. It doesn't have to naturally be in silos. Just because things grew that way doesn't mean that they have to stay that way. If any single Prime Minister decided it wasn't going to operate that way and put one working party together with some academics from the Grantham, for instance, they could lead on that. I'd happily come sit at the table, but they can run it. We could feed in that academic input, and we could tell them what those policy solutions were in an apolitical way, which doesn't matter what colour the government is. And I think they should just do it. You're absolutely right, especially in a time of austerity. We should be spending our money much more wisely for the benefit of everybody.
Great.
Two slightly random ideas on it.
Yeah,
one
go on,
is
Tom. Yeah.
working with the Scottish Government, and I don't know if other people's impression, but the way they set up the Scottish Government is not departmental in the same way as Westminster. So if we were to pilot something, I wonder whether that might be a fruitful place to start. Really random idea, this is not my area, but thinking about health insurance companies. So we get quite nice benefits at the Carbon Trust, including private health insurance, and we get incentivized to sign up to the gym, and a lot of preventary measures part of health insurance. So it does strike me, and my health insurance does not offer me to pay for my insulation, but why wouldn't it if it did have that direct benefit on health? A random idea, but I thought I'd toss it in.
I know Dustin only had a virtual microphone, but if you could pass it along to Sir Graham, that would be very nice.
Thank you very much. Graham William, International Sustainability Unit and UK Climate Change Adaptation Committee. Thank Grantham and all of the presenters. Excellent, stimulating stuff. All of you have, to a lesser or greater extent, said that the principal problems are no longer technical, but political. Hugh's been absolutely categorical about it, but it's come through all the presentations. And without downplaying any of the technical needs that we still undoubtedly have, and I think some of the principal things are about planning and integration, actually more than pure technical. But putting those just one side for a moment, what is it, incredibly briefly, that each one of you thinks that either you or we are not currently doing that we could be doing to stimulate greater political commitment, leadership, and overcoming political challenges, if that's what the real issue now is?
I'll let the panel just digest that while I repeat it for the webcast listeners. What is the single thing, if the main challenges are now not technical but they are political, what is the single thing that we, I guess however we define we, could be doing that we're not doing now to unblock progress? And I'd like to go along the panel again, and perhaps you could just keep it really, really brief and concise this time. Just one thing that could be done to unblock the political leadership. We should start at this end, I think, this time for fairness. Andrew Norton?
Yeah, not keeping time this time. But, I mean, I think it's a tricky question because we were dealing with different issues. I mean, the issues around the political will to confront, climate change mitigation are somewhat different to the areas I was talking about around political will and political conditions, if you like, political incentives that enable local resilience. But I would say my one thing I think would be to look at ways of delivering resources in such a way that broadly democratic local institutions can be built that will have a voice in policy from the local to the global level.
Fascinating. Walter.
Very tricky question indeed. Well, I think as a scientist in an applied field, I'll come back, it's like always, come back to the same issue, but really try and foster that link with policy levels and continue to try and think how we can make our scientific results more accessible to levels of policy making.
I think, Graham, if I interpret your question correctly, you'll sort of have a slightly wider definition of we here in this, don't you, rather than sort of what I can do as a scientist or what I can do as a journalist or whatever.
It's either way. But
Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting that there's an assumption there that clear representation of the evidence will make political change, and I think that's highly questionable, either at national or local level. So it's kind of yes, obviously we need to do that, but do any of us have any ideas about under the current extraordinarily difficult political situation? Climate, I accept that, austerity and all the rest of it. I accept it's not easy, but what is it that we're not doing that might shift things forward?
Okay, Tom.
I would hope the government would listen to industry, and so as much as industry could communicate to the government the benefits of all this stuff and the fact that it is doable, and globally as well, it's not just a UK issue, but obviously in US, especially with the Republican Party, there seems to be this, climate change is some kind of evil plot to shackle business, whilst there are huge opportunities across all those different technologies I had up on the board to develop new jobs, and that will then benefit everybody who works in those industries. So as much as can be done, and coming up to COP and the voice of industry at COP, but then practically afterwards in then engaging and deploying this stuff.
Thank you. Jenny.
Okay, as a scientist working on energy technologies, I think what I pick up here would be a better cooperation between the people who are involved at different stages, maybe developing and deploying design systems to show how to sort of to talk together and present something which is sort of beneficial for everybody in that chain, because at the moment we tend to be quite compartmentalized, and I think possibly because of the ways research and industry are structured, that the opportunities from sort of working with other people at different places in the system are not taken up. So I think get together and sort of develop something which is good for all of us and put that forward and sort of not retreat into our own cages.
So set better examples, talking together. Hugh.
It's interesting, we're all saying the same things in different ways. I think there is an issue about education, actually. Tom will tell us whether it's still true that there's only one person in the British House of Commons with a scientific degree at all. That was the case.
I'm not even sure if there's one now.
There may
but,
not even be one.
Yeah.
But the problem is you're dealing with people without any scientific literature at all about whether it be energy or solar radiation or ecosystems. So there is an issue for education. So to answer your question directly, if I had access to David Cameron, I'd ask for access. I'd say, let the Grantham organise the session to teach your cabinet and your MPs in the House of Commons about these issues. It'll take a morning to do it, but we can get you all up to speed. The second thing I'd do is say, break the silos down, give permission to your departments to start meeting and talking together. And the third thing is, I exactly agree with Jenny, let's present the solutions, not the problems. If you go into the problem, you're going to get the can kicked down the road. You're going to say, here's a solution, we'd like to do it right now. If you don't like it, you can give another one, but we do need to act.
And if those solutions particularly have other wins, other than just being virtuous, they save a lot of money, they bring investment into Great Britain, those are good things. And I don't think those solutions are difficult to put on the table, actually. So education, access, silo busting, solutions, not problems.
Thanks. Paolo?
Well, something I should do is to start a conversation with industry around food, because this is really a dramatic problem now, the increase in non-communicable diseases. But in a way, we are frightened by the relationships with industry, because it is difficult, it is a huge problem. In the meantime, there is something I do, because it is on a smaller scale, which is to find cheap and easy solutions for a specific problem we are facing in Bangladesh related to climate change. And we are doing experiments with different ways to provide fresh water to people with cheap technologies. So when we were talking about innovation, we shouldn't forget that innovation is also to look for cheap, accessible technologies. And sometimes solutions are very simple and scalable.
Great, thank you. Now, we've had a question in from someone watching the webcast. I don't have his or her name, unfortunately, and it's also a little bit of a vague question, but I think that's kind of good, because you can interpret it how you want. And the question is very simple. There's lots of talk about government action, and I suppose, to be fair, we have been talking quite a lot about government action. What about bottom-up action? And I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, all three of you are working in areas such as human health and energy and so on, and I suppose justice and climate justice and so on, where there is citizen action and there's scope for quite a lot more. So I mean, interesting to have what thoughts you have on the role of that, how it can be more influential in your particular area. Who'd like to have a go at that first? Paolo?
Yeah, just a word. There is an interesting initiative funded by the European Commission, which is called Citizens, which puts together technological developments in sensors to measure environmental pollution, but within communities and with participation of the community. So it is, in a way, making new technologies available for the communities. It is about pollution and the environment. It's not climate change, but it is interesting because of the combination of participation, empowerment, and technology.
Yes, I've wondered about that. You hear stories keep coming through, don't they, about these sort of personal pollution monitors, and one would think it would increase people's engagement with the issue. Hugh?
It's a good question. So this is a personal view about why we had this paresis in response to climate, and it's my view it's because we've got this very difficult interlink of a triangle between politics, the body politic, business, and the general population. And the body politic says, well, we can't act on it, because if we do, this is like serving cold sick at a dinner party, to quote a Ken Livingston, I think from some years ago, about congestion charging. People won't vote for it, therefore we won't go there. Businesses say, well, if government won't legislate to make it an even playing field and encourage us, we can't act, besides which the people won't buy it. And the people say, well, unless the government allow us and help us and business don't give us an opportunity, there's nothing we can do. And that gets tessellated worldwide. So a business might say, well, we can't act here, because if we did, we just lose market share and people will offshore it. And whatever we do in Britain as individuals, it doesn't matter, because someone in India won't do the same thing. If we just deal with the people bit, I mean, every group of those, the politics, the business, and the people have got to do something. And the people can. So we can change the political landscape. We've got a very disenfranchised populace in terms of voting, which means that every vote now is more powerful than it perhaps has ever been before. So we can start driving the political agenda as people if we choose to. And we can also start making demands of business. So we can start choosing where we spend our pounds. I'm guessing most people in this room already do that, but we make a choice with our pounds that we will not shop with that in that chain. We will not buy from that shop. We will not buy that product. Or if we have a choice of three, we'll choose this one. Those things businesses will respond to exceedingly well, even if they're not virtuous. So I don't think we should discount the fact that people are important.
Great. Thank you. Now, I would like to take, we've only got about sort of 5 minutes left, so what I suggest we do is just quickly go around the people and be really quick if you can about your point or your question, and we'll get as many reflections as we can. So yes, gentleman here first, please.
I want really to follow up this bottom-up thing
Yeah.
We can all blame the government. What about the medical profession? Have they changed towards prevention rather than cure as a result of your two commissions?
Thank you, lovely. Gentlemen, a couple of rows back on this side also. Yeah, that's right.
Recommendation to you, Dr. Mogami. You mentioned that introducing numbers and values. So you suggest this number is simplified, like a presentation tell in a TV. Then it could impact the society or general.
Right, get Hugh's numbers on TV. There's a cluster of three over there, but one gentleman on this. Yes, please. Yeah.
So this is Lord Blackson from Health England. Very interested to promote the co-benefits agenda. It's a very powerful message. What's the best way of raising awareness and promoting this very compelling case?
Thank you. And yep, please.
Jeff Darch from Mechanisms. How can we get economics and decision making, which is driven by economics, to better value the benefits of prevention?
Thank you. The gentleman right on the end with the white shirt.
Craig Daniel, Chief Executive of Friends of the Earth. Thanks, Hugh, for your very good presentation. If climate change is a critical health issue, why is it most health professionals don't see it as such?
Thank you. And there was one other hand up. Yes, I think.
The answers to this are very much in terms of individual choice. I just wonder what individual choices the panel members have made to change their lifestyle.
Well, I think we'll definitely end with that one. But all of the other questions were to really Paolo and Hugh. So do you want to take those first sort of health ones first?
Okay, well, answer them very quickly so you've got time. Has the Lancet Commission and the other work on help tilt towards prevention and cure? Not yet, but well, that's not true. It has tilted it, and there are some really big changes ongoing at the moment. That's not just us. There's synergy with Simon Stevens and others who are recognising this too. I think there is a really virtuous set of forces coming to play at the moment where everyone's realising we cannot continue the health service as it is by propping up people in their states of collapse. We've got to move to prevention first. So that is happening now, and yes, it has had traction. Simple messaging, absolutely, totally agree. Probably don't need to say much more about it than that.
And you have done the Royal Institution Christmas lectures, haven't you, as well? So
yes,
you have got some of those numbers on TV.
And we've done some stuff in children's education, which is actually itself probably the most powerful thing. And in terms of promoting the co-benefits, I think that's a very interesting thing. It's a question, I forget who was asked the co-benefits question, but yeah, I think it's a question of how you frame it. So I had a conversation with an individual in politics last year where I was saying, who was being very recidivist, saying it's a personal choice, 4x4s will cross every road, everyone can drive, etc., no stuff the active transport agenda. And I was saying, well, how do you feel about it? Do you know people who've had breast cancer? Oh yes, I'm at an age where I know 20, 30, how do you feel that you're responsible for 3 or 4 of those deaths? Well, I'm not responsible. Well, you are actually, because if you'd implemented active transport policies, 1 in 7 of those women would still be alive today. So it's a question of the messaging of how you do it. People have got to understand the connection. And again, I'm not sure I'd be beating up individuals about that. I think this is much more to get the message to policy.
And what are the other one, health-related, was getting economists to value, put money on this.
And that's because we haven't linked those two things until recently. So Andy Haynes, who's not here today, has been a real leader in that, and others probably at the Grantham have done the same. I mean, this whole health economics of co-benefits has never been done properly. Andy's produced those data from his commission report first in, I think, 2010, and they were absolutely startling of just how much money could be saved. The challenge now is the question we had here earlier on about how you then get that into a policy issue by breaking down the silos. The other question, which is a good challenge, if this is all such a threat to health, why isn't it seen as such by the health community? And that's because they weren't educated and didn't understand it. If you spoke to a doctor 5 years ago, their view is you dealt with the problem across the desk from you. That really has radically changed. When Virginia and I were at the COP processes probably 5, 6 years ago, I think you could probably count on the fingers of one hand, certainly under 2, the number of health professionals at the entire conference of tens of thousands of people. Now there are thousands and there are negotiators there, and it is radically changing, and you are going to hear big things, I can tell you now, in the next probably 6 to 8 weeks from the UK health community at very senior level. So it's an embarrassment that it wasn't active before, but it is now. And I'll leave the choices lifestyle thing to the last thing.
Well, absolutely. And just before we do that, Paolo, have you got anything to add on any of these questions relating to health and medicine?
One sentence that is the economic argument is very strong, and it should be promoted much more, because in this period all governments tend to access the National Health Service, but people do not realize how many gains you might have from prevention. And I participated in the writing of the Cancer Atlas of the American Cancer Society, and I was really surprised by the figures, because you can save a lot of money through prevention. And basically, we cannot afford treatment of cancer and diabetes in the next years. It is not compatible with our economies. So this is probably the strongest argument, but of course there is also an ethical argument in favor of prevention. It's not only economics.
Great. So while Paolo and Hugh have been fielding those questions, hopefully the other four of you have had time to prepare what you're going to say. So let's just very quickly just go along the row. What's the one thing? I think it's probably okay if there's nothing, frankly, but is there one thing you've done to sort of change what you do, your behaviour, your lifestyle, as a result of all the information coming in about climate change and development?
I'll just say something else first about the...
if you're very quick.
The bottom-up theme, which is, I think, international processes, agreements, conferences work where there's a lot of mobilisation.
Yeah.
And I think that's what brings the big hope for Paris as against Copenhagen.
And now the focus.
Scale of that globally.
And now the focus is on you.
Yeah, the focus on me. There's a few things. There's probably much more I could do, but we haven't. One thing, my family hadn't taken a leisure flight for some years. I can't remember the last time we did. Just one thing.
Thank you, Walter.
Cycling into college, not too sure whether it's really a health benefit in London at this time.
Tom?
I leverage my individual co-benefits. So heating reduces the energy bill. I've decided to work in London, and that's where I'm going to be focusing, so I commute on public transport. I had a kid, so now I don't want to fly anywhere because it's a nightmare. And less red meat is healthier. So I'm no saint, but once you add some of these things together, actually it becomes a much easier choice.
Fantastic. Jenny?
So in terms of what I've done, so I don't eat meat, I've never owned a car, I cycle everywhere. But what I ought to do is find a way to do our international collaboration without international travel. That's what I'd like to do.
You?
As a summary of those, we decided to move the money, so because that's really what matters. So moved energy supplier, that's dead easy, 100% renewable, they've got plenty of choices to do that. That's easy, why give you money to fossil fuels if we don't have to? Move banks, choice of foods, local, vegetable, etc., not flown in, and seasonal, that's easy to do too. Heating, we did the same thing. I came back once from a climbing trip 10 years ago and realised I'd been on Everest and I was quite warm because I had the right clothes on. So actually, you can turn the heating down and wear a few more clothes and it works quite well. Again, no car in London, cycle and use public transport if we have to, and avoid flying as much as possible as well. And it's a suite of activities, I think, that makes a difference rather than any one thing.
And Paolo?
Well, personal experience, I had high cholesterol. The usual suggestion, recommendation from a physician would be take statins. I didn't. I went on diet and physical exercise, and it was much better and more effective and with a lot of co-benefits.
Excellent. I kind of feel we should have a vote, but let's not. Well, look, I'd like to personally thank the Grantham Institute for inviting me. It's been a real honour and a privilege and a fascinating afternoon for me. I hope it has been for you too. And Martin Siegert's going to say a few more words, but before he does, perhaps I can ask you to show your thanks to the panel in the usual sense.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to everyone. I've got an unenviable job, and that is to try and tie everything up at the same time that you want to be having a drink, and at the same time also that you want to be standing up, because these seats are particularly uncomfortable, and it actually is really nice when you get up. So I'll keep this quick if I can. So many thanks to our panel, to Andrew, Walter, Tom, Jenny, Hugh and Paolo. Round of applause for all of those again. Wonderful talks, great questions. That's really super. And also we need to give Richard clearly a round of applause for the wonderful way in which he's chaired this afternoon. Thank you. So, what have we learned? Of talks, presentations and questions. Andrew mentioned the benefits of local solutions and the idea that we have to have national and global structures to support those local solutions. Tom talks about the way in which no country can do these solutions on their own. We need to work together. And Hugh mentioned, very interestingly, about timescales and how the accumulation of small effects build up to difficult problems. It's really a sort of a classic multidisciplinary study in space and time that we're all engaged in with this issue on climate change and how to solve it. Now, this is not new, this idea about space and time. In fact, it's a very geographical type of thing. If you go to the top of Exhibition Road, the Royal Geographical Society is there. And classically in geography, you will study human geography, which is, imagine a globe, and it's got maps of countries and boundaries and roads and railways, flight paths, those sort of things. And physical geography, and that's got mountains. Your globe's got mountains and rivers and clouds and oceans, and the Antarctic ice sheet. I'm a polar scientist. It's got ice in it as well, of course. We don't live in two worlds. We live in one world. And the challenge to us is to try and fuse the thinking of that human environment, which we all inhabit, with the physical planet that we are affecting. And this is not a new thing either. This idea about bringing these two concepts together has been around a long time. In fact, when I first started being an academic, more than 20 years ago, this thing was explained to me. And I suddenly thought, well, 20 years is quite a short period in time, really, an academic career halfway through. A lot has changed in 20 years. Our appreciation of this problem has changed. I mean, huge things have changed. We didn't have iPhones or any mobile phones 20 years ago. Email was it was existing, but it was pretty low level. Twitter didn't even, I think Mark Zuckerberg was a young child 20 years ago. And if you ever, as an academic, submitted a scientific paper, you'd have had to have done 10 copies in hard copy, staple them together and put them in a great big package. Now you click a button and it goes in. Things change hugely in 20 years. And what I've noticed is that 20 years ago, we simply did not have meetings like this. We didn't have, in a university, a very outward face where people come in and have a collective, multidisciplinary discussion about the things that really matter. Things have moved on. 20 years is a short period in time, but actually we've learned a lot about how to communicate with each other, about how to think about this shared problem in a multidisciplinary way. So, Virginia, thanks very much, and others, for saying how important the Grantham Institute is, because we, as Joe said earlier, we are an institute, like some others, that tries to pick up this interdisciplinary problem, because it's not a new thing, but it's clearly a new and emerging way of working. We haven't solved the problem of climate change yet, but we understand it, and that's a very important thing. And indeed, as we learned today, we kind of know how to solve it as well. We do know how to do it. We just need more conversations like this, more goodwill, and more support. And at this particular time in the evening, I'd like to continue that thought over a glass of wine or something with you in the room, along the corridor down there. So thank you ever so much for being with us. Let's stop there and have a drink. Thank you.